Picture a vast parchment, yellowed with age, stretched out on a table. The known world is drawn carefully. In the center, familiar coastlines, cities, rivers. But as your eye travels towards the edges, the precise lines begin to falter. The oceans swell with coiled sea serpents. The uncharted continents are guarded by strange, fantastical beasts. And written in elegant script along the margin are those three tantalizing words, "Here be dragons." This was not merely decoration. This was the edge of reality as our ancestors understood it, a world where belief was as powerful a cartographic tool as any compass or astrolabe. These maps were not just guides, they were stories, declarations of faith, and vivid proof that the human imagination has always been one of the greatest forces in shaping our perception of the world. But what if the most important and influential maps ever drawn were not charts of real places at all? What if, instead of guiding travelers to physical destinations, they led the way into the very heart of myth itself? For centuries, across countless cultures, civilizations used the language of geography, the precise placement of mountains, the careful tracing of rivers, the naming of islands, to document realms that existed only in legend and collective dream. They meticulously charted the sunken spires of Atlantis, mapped the exact location of the earthly paradise, and gave precise coordinates to kingdoms ruled by long-lost Christian kings. These were not simple mistakes or fanciful doodles. They were complete geographies of places that never were, and yet they exerted a force on human history that is almost impossible to overstate. They launched ships, inspired empires, and fundamentally altered our understanding of our own planet. This is a journey into that astonishing space where imagination and geography collide. We are about to explore the maps of ancient realms that never existed, to understand why humans have always felt this profound need to fill the blank spaces on the map, not with silence but with meaning. We will see how these cartographic fantasies directly fueled the age of exploration, sending real-world adventurers across treacherous oceans in search of phantom islands and lost cities. We will uncover how these fictional landscapes became woven into the fabric of our culture, from ancient scriptures to modern blockbuster films. And ultimately, we will discover that the allure of these non-existent lands reveals a profound truth about us, that our deepest desire is not just to know what is there, but to explain what is not. We are about to dive into the greatest story ever mapped, the story of how we charted our dreams. Imagine for a moment the profound silence of a blank space on a map. For us today, with satellite imagery that can zoom in on a single car parked on a street anywhere in the world, an empty area on a screen is simply a place we have not yet bothered to look at in high definition. But for a medieval cartographer dipping his quill into ink by the light of a candle, that emptiness was not just empty, it was a roaring void. It was a question mark that stretched for thousands of miles, an abyss of the unknown that threatened to swallow the very order of the known world. And nature, as the old saying goes, abhors a vacuum. So did the human mind. That empty space had to be filled. But with what? Without GPS or even reliable accounts, the only thing a mapmaker could fill it with was meaning. And the most powerful source of meaning has always been story. This is why maps needed monsters. The sea serpent coiled in the ocean, the dragon sleeping on a mountain range, the giant standing guard over an uncharted shore. These were not just whimsical illustrations. They were sophisticated cartographic symbols, a kind of shorthand that conveyed crucial information. A monster on a map was a stark, unambiguous warning. It signaled danger, the absolute limit of safe travel. It told a sailor or a merchant, beyond this point, we cannot guarantee your safety. Here, the rules of your civilized world may no longer apply. This was a practical function born from a genuine respect for the perils of exploration, but it was also something deeper, something psychological. By giving a face to the unknown, a terrifying, scaly, fire-breathing face, the mapmaker was domesticating fear itself. It is far less frightening to confront a dragon you can see and name than to stare into a formless, silent fog of pure uncertainty. These creatures were also expressions of the culture that created them. The fears and fascinations of a society were projected directly onto its geography. In Europe, for instance, the edges of the world were often populated with what were called the monstrous races. These beings came not from pure imagination, but from very old and supposedly authoritative texts. The Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder, in the 1st century, compiled a massive encyclopedia of the natural world that was treated as scientific fact for over 1,000 years. Within its pages, he recorded the incredible tales of travelers, stories of the Blemii, a tribe of headless men with their faces on their chests, the Cynosphali, or dog-headed men who communicated through barks, and the Ostomi, who lived on the scent of apples and had no mouth. These were not presented as myths, but as the bizarre yet real inhabitants of distant lands. Medieval mapmakers, trusting these ancient sources, diligently placed these races in the blank spaces of Africa and Asia. They became real features on the map, as tangible as any river or city. This practice reveals a fundamental truth about these ancient maps. They were not just navigational tools, they were narratives. A map was a storybook written in coastlines and continents. It told the story of what a culture believed about the world, its own place in that world, and the nature of humanity itself. The world was not a neutral collection of geological features. It was a stage for history, legend, and divine will. A map might show you the route from London to Rome, but it would also show you where the Garden of Eden was located, where Alexander the Great built his gates to keep out the tribes of Gog and Magog, and where St. Brendan discovered his magical island. The map was a holistic picture of reality, blending the physical, the historical, and the spiritual into a single, coherent image. To understand the world, you had to understand all of its stories. The blank space, therefore, was an unacceptable tier in the narrative. Filling it with monsters and marvels was an act of completing the story, of ensuring that the entire world made sense according to the knowledge and beliefs of the time. It was the first step in our long journey to decode the maps of ancient realms, because it teaches us to read them not as failed science, but as profound cultural diaries. So we understand the impulse to fill the blank spaces, but what exactly were cartographers filling them with? It is one thing to draw a dragon in the margin, but quite another to chart the precise coastline of an entire continent that no one has ever seen. This brings us to a crucial distinction. What separates a simple local legend from a full-blown, map-worthy mythical geography? Not every story about a haunted forest or a magical spring qualifies. To earn its place on a world map, a mythical geography needs to meet a specific set of criteria, transforming it from a folktale into a perceived geographical fact. First and foremost, a true mythical geography is a coherent and detailed spatial concept. It is not just a name or a vague idea, it is a place with a defined landscape. Think of Plato's description of Atlantis. He did not simply say there was a powerful island. He described its concentric rings of water and land, its grand canal system, its specific location beyond the Pillars of Hercules, and even the materials used in its construction. It had a topography, a layout, a geography. This level of concrete detail is what makes a myth feel like a potential reality. It provides the mental map that a cartographer can then attempt to translate onto parchment. Similarly, the Garden of Eden was not just a nice garden. It was described as the source of 4 great rivers, which meant medieval mapmakers could, and did, try to trace those rivers back to their divine source, placing Eden firmly on their world charts. This leads to the second key characteristic, integration into a culture's worldview. A mythical geography is widely believed, or at least accepted as plausible, by a significant portion of a society. Its existence is woven into the fabric of that culture's understanding of the world. For medieval Europe, the earthly paradise was not a matter of debate, it was a tenet of faith. The Bible described it, theologians wrote about it, and therefore it had to be a physical place on God's earth. Its presence on a map was a statement of religious and cosmological truth, not a speculative fantasy. The same was true for the kingdom of Prester John. For centuries, kings, popes, and merchants acted on the belief that this powerful Christian ally existed somewhere in the East. This belief directly influenced foreign policy, trade routes, and exploration. The myth had tangible consequences because it was integrated into the working model of the world. Furthermore, these realms often operate under their own unique laws of nature, setting them apart from the ordinary world. They exist in a space that defies conventional physics or biology. The Fountain of Youth reverses the aging process. Hyperborea, the mythical land beyond the north wind, was said to enjoy a perfect spring-like climate year-round, a meteorological impossibility in the far north. These are places where the normal rules are suspended, which is precisely what makes them both alluring and plausible as distant, hidden wonders. Their inaccessibility is not just a matter of distance, but of their fundamental otherness. They are often situated in what we might call the peripherally known areas that are just on the edge of cultural awareness. They are across an impassable ocean, at the unreachable peak of a mountain, deep within an impenetrable jungle, or even in a celestial sphere just beyond our own. This positioning is strategic. It places them just far enough away to be unexplorable, but just close enough to be believable. By establishing this framework, we can see the difference between a legend and a mythical geography. A story about a ghost in a local castle is a legend, but a detailed description of a vast, wealthy Christian kingdom in the heart of Asia, complete with its own geography, inhabitants, and a history of correspondence with European popes, that is a mythical geography. It is the scale, the coherence, and the cultural integration that elevates a story to the status of a place. This conceptual framework is our essential tool for the investigation to come. It allows us to analyze the maps we will explore not as collections of random errors, but as deliberate attempts to chart these persistent cartographic ghosts, these powerful, non-existent places that, for a time, became as real as any city or country on Earth. To truly grasp the origins of these cartographic phantoms, we must set our course for the sun-drenched shores of the ancient Mediterranean, where the very concept of the West was being forged. It was in the city-states of Greece and the sprawling empire of Rome that poets and philosophers first masterfully blended observation with imagination, creating a foundational world where the line between the real and the legendary was beautifully, intentionally blurred. This was not an age of scientific cartography as we know it. Their maps were as much works of literature and philosophy as they were of geography. And at the very heart of this tradition stands one of the most epic journeys ever recorded, Homer's Odyssey. Composed nearly 3,000 years ago, the Odyssey is far more than a simple adventure story. It is a monumental catalogue of mythical geography. As the hero Odysseus struggles to return home from the Trojan War, he is blown off course into a world of wonders and terrors that exist just beyond the edge of the known Greek world. He encounters the land of the Lotus Eaters, whose inhabitants live in a blissful, drugged apathy, a place that serves as a warning against the loss of purpose and memory. He navigates past the island of the Sirens, whose beautiful song lures sailors to their doom on the rocks, a powerful metaphor for temptation and the perils of desire. He spends a year on the island of Ea with the enchantress Circe, who turns his men into swine, a story exploring themes of bestiality, magic, and the loss of human reason. Each of these locations, Ea, the Cyclops' island, the underworld itself, was given a specific, albeit vague, placement in the Mediterranean or just beyond its pillars. For centuries after, Greek and Roman scholars would debate their exact locations, treating Homer not as a poet of fiction, but as a geographer of immense, albeit cryptic, authority. His epic provided a ready-made atlas of the strange and marvelous, a template that would be copied onto real maps for generations to come. Yet, if Homer provided the wondrous scenery, it was the philosopher Plato who gave the world its most enduring and influential lost land. Around 360 years before the Common Era, in his dialogues The Timaeus and the Critias, Plato introduced the world to Atlantis. His description was not that of a whimsical folktale, but of a detailed, plausible history. He described Atlantis as a powerful and advanced island nation located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. It was larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, a formidable naval power that attempted to conquer the ancient Mediterranean world until it was repelled by the ideal state of Athens. Finally, as a consequence of its hubris and moral decay, the entire island sank beneath the waves in a single day and night of catastrophic earthquakes and floods, vanishing forever into the ocean. Crucially, we must understand that Plato was not trying to write a history book. He was using the story of Atlantis as a philosophical device, a moral allegory. Atlantis represented the dangers of imperial ambition, wealth, and corruption. Its perfect, concentric ringed city was a counterpoint to his ideal republic, showing how even a great civilization could fall from grace. The story served a clear purpose: to illustrate a philosophical point about the cyclical nature of history and the divine punishment that awaits arrogant societies. However, the very specificity of his description, the precise dimensions, the geographic location, the political structure proved too compelling to remain a mere metaphor. Later writers, taking Plato at his word, began to treat Atlantis as a real historical place. The legend took on a life of its own, completely detached from its original philosophical context. This tendency to treat classical literature as factual authority is the key to understanding how these myths became map features. Greek and Roman scholars like Herodotus, the father of history, and Pliny the Elder, whom we met earlier, wove together first-hand accounts, travelers' tales, and poetic legends into single, authoritative texts. There was no clear distinction between a verified fact and a compelling story. If a respected author like Herodotus reported that there were gold-digging ants the size of foxes in India, or that Pliny described the monstrous Blemii, these claims were absorbed into the body of accepted knowledge. The classical worldview was an encyclopedic one, seeking to catalogue everything that might be, from the mundane to the miraculous. This classical inheritance did not fade with the Roman Empire. Instead, it was preserved and sanctified. When medieval Christian scholars in Europe looked to understand the shape and history of the world, they turned to two primary sources: the Bible and the works of the classical authors. Greek and Roman learning was revered as the pinnacle of human wisdom. So, when a monk in a scriptorium sat down to draw a map of the world, he was faced with a fascinating challenge: how to reconcile the spiritual geography of Scripture with the earthly, and often fantastical, geography of Plato, Homer, and Pliny. The solution was a magnificent synthesis. The Garden of Eden could sit comfortably at the top of a map alongside the monstrous races described by Pliny. The island of Atlantis could be charted in the Atlantic Ocean based on Plato's coordinates. These were not seen as contradictions. The classical authors were considered unimpeachable authorities, their words as much a source of truth as any traveler's journal. This deep reverence for ancient texts meant that for over a millennium, the the mythical geographies invented by Greek poets and philosophers were seamlessly woven into the fabric of European cartography, transforming philosophical allegories into seemingly real destinations waiting to be rediscovered. If the classical world gave us the template for mythical geography, then medieval Christianity provided the ultimate motivation for mapping it. For a devout European cartographer, the single most important location to chart was not a bustling trade city or a strategic mountain pass, but a place no living human had ever seen, the Garden of Eden. This was not a matter of speculative curiosity, it was a profound theological necessity. The Bible was understood as the literal, historical truth, and within its opening pages, it described a real, physical paradise where humanity began. To leave Eden off a map of God's creation would be an unthinkable omission, a denial of the very foundation of human history and divine providence. The map, therefore, had to tell the whole story from Genesis to Revelation. This conviction produced one of the most striking and consistent features of medieval world maps, or Mundi. If you look at a masterpiece like the Hereford Mappa Mundi, created around the year 1300, your eye is immediately drawn to the top. There, separated from the rest of the world by a fiery ring of angels or a formidable wall, sits a perfect circular enclosure. This is the earthly paradise, depicted not as a vague concept but as a specific architectural space. Inside its walls, you can often see Adam and Eve, the serpent coiled around the tree of knowledge, a poignant reminder of the moment of the fall that both created history and barred humanity from ever returning to this perfect origin point. The most critical geographical clue, however, flows directly from this garden, the four rivers of paradise. The book of Genesis names them as the Pishon, the Gihon, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. Medieval scholars seized on this detail. They knew the Tigris and Euphrates were real rivers in Mesopotamia. Therefore, they reasoned, Eden must be located at the source of these waters. Since these rivers flowed from east to west, Eden had to be situated at the extreme eastern edge of the known world, a place of pristine origins from which all life ultimately flowed. This placed paradise in a realm that was geographically coherent yet utterly inaccessible, sealed off after the fall by divine decree. The placement of Eden at the top of the map was also deeply symbolic. Medieval maps were often oriented with east at the top, the direction of the rising sun, which they called Oriens, the origin. This was the direction of Jerusalem, the Holy Land, and ultimately paradise itself. This orientation, known as an east-up map, created a spiritual hierarchy. At the top, you had perfection and the beginning of time. At the bottom, you had the known world of Europe and Africa, existing in a state of post-lapsarian history. The map was not just a spatial representation. It was a timeline and a moral landscape, with humanity's lost home always hovering just out of reach above them, a constant reminder of what was lost and a symbol of what could be regained through salvation. But what happened when exploration began to challenge this tidy, theological geography? The age of discovery presented a monumental problem for the traditional location of Eden. As Portuguese ships sailed down the coast of Africa and Spanish caravels crossed the Atlantic, the Far East was no longer a mysterious, unreachable edge. It was becoming a mapped and navigated space, and there was no walled garden to be found. This forced a fascinating shift in speculation. If Eden wasn't in the Far East, perhaps it was somewhere even more remote. The newly discovered Americas, a vast and utterly unknown continent, became the perfect candidate for paradise. Here was a land untouched by the history of the Old World, teeming with what seemed like primordial beauty and abundance. Some explorers and theologians began to suggest that South America, with its mighty rivers like the Amazon or the lush islands of the Caribbean, might be the true location of the earthly paradise. It was a breathtaking leap of imagination. The entire narrative of human history was being remapped onto a new world. This theory was fueled by reports from explorers who described these new lands in terms that echoed the descriptions of paradise, a land of eternal spring, with incredible fruits and gentle, innocent people. The quest to locate Eden, therefore, did not end with the expansion of geographical knowledge. It simply adapted, demonstrating the incredible power of a core belief to reshape the interpretation of new evidence. The map had to accommodate scripture, even if it meant moving heaven on earth to an entirely new hemisphere. Now, let's hold that thought about the earthly paradise and bring it into stunning, tangible focus by examining one of the single most magnificent artifacts to survive from the Middle Ages, the Hereford Mappa Mundi. Created around the year 1300, this isn't just a map. It's a sprawling, intricate canvas roughly 5 feet tall by 4 feet wide, drawn on a single sheet of vellum. To stand before it is to be overwhelmed by a dense tapestry of pictures and text, a visual symphony where every inch tells a story. But if you were a traveler in the 1300s and you unfurled this document to plan a journey from England to Jerusalem, you would be utterly lost. The coastlines are distorted, the proportions are strange, and the distances are a fantasy. That's because the Mappa Mundi was never intended to guide a body across the land. Its purpose was far more profound, to guide a soul through time, faith, and the entire cosmic order of creation. This magnificent map functions as a visual encyclopedia of everything a devout Christian was meant to understand about the world and their place within it. It is a complete fusion of geography, history, legend, and theology. At the very top, just as we discussed, sits the Garden of Eden, depicted as a circular walled city, with Adam and Eve inside and a fiery sword-wielding angel blocking the entrance. From this divine source, the 4 rivers of paradise flow down into the world. Jerusalem, the city of Christ's passion, is placed at the very center of the circle, the spiritual heart of the world. And radiating out from this holy center are all the lands of the earth, populated not just with real cities like Rome and Paris, but with hundreds of vignettes from the Bible, classical mythology, and medieval legend. Here, the journey of Noah's Ark is just as geographically important as the shape of Spain. The location of the golden fleece from the tale of Jason and the Argonauts is given a specific spot on the Black Sea, its story woven seamlessly into the landscape. The map doesn't separate fact from fiction. It presents a unified narrative where sacred history is geography. This blending is perhaps most vividly illustrated in the margins of the known world, where the monstrous races reside. In the south, on the continent of Africa, you'll find the Cyapods, men with a single, enormous foot which they use to shade themselves from the sun. There are the Blemii, the headless men with faces on their chests, and the Cynosphali, the dog-headed men. These are not random grotesqueries. Their placement on the map is deliberate. They inhabit the far edges, the hottest, most distant zones from the civilized center of Jerusalem. They represent the outer limits of God's creation, a manifestation of the strange and wonderful diversity of life, but also a symbolic boundary. They define, by contrast, what it means to be civilized and Christian. Their existence was considered factual, drawn from the authoritative texts of Pliny and other classical writers, and their inclusion on the map served to educate viewers about the full, bewildering scope of God's work. The map's orientation is the final, crucial key to understanding its purpose. Unlike our modern maps, which almost universally place north at the top, the Hereford Mappa Mundi is oriented with east at the summit. This is why paradise is at the top. East, or Oriens, was the direction of the rising sun, symbolizing the dawn of creation, the light of Christ, and the origin of all things. This east-up orientation creates a powerful spiritual hierarchy. At the top, you have the beginning, Eden, At the center, you have the pivotal moment of human salvation, Jerusalem. And at the bottom, you have the known world of Europe, existing in the present age, looking up towards its origin and its salvation. The map is therefore a journey narrative in itself, inviting the viewer to trace a path from their own worldly existence upward towards redemption. It is a moral landscape, a diagram of hope. The Hereford Mappa Mundi is the ultimate case study in medieval myth cartography. It shows us that for its creators and viewers, the most accurate map wasn't the one that best showed the physical lay of the land, but the one that most faithfully illustrated the story of God's plan for humanity. It was a map designed not for the feet, but for the spirit. But if the Hereford Mappa Mundi represented a world view centered on faith and scripture, there was another, more terrifying void on the map that called to a different kind of believer, the adventurer. For any European looking westward, the known world ended at the Pillars of Hercules, the great cliffs flanking the Strait of Gibraltar. Beyond that lay the Mare Tenebrosum, the Sea of Darkness. This was the Atlantic Ocean, an expanse of water so vast and unpredictable that it seemed to swallow the horizon itself. It was the ultimate blank space, a geographic question mark that both terrified and tantalized the medieval mind. And into this abyss, cartographers and storytellers projected their most powerful and enduring fantasies, creating phantoms that would ultimately pull real ships into the unknown. The grandest of these Atlantic phantoms was, without a doubt, Atlantis. We have already seen how Plato's allegorical tale of a sunken civilization was taken as historical fact. But its specific location, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, is what made it a cartographic star of the Atlantic. For centuries, scholars debated not if Atlantis had existed, but where its remnants might be found. Some suggested the Canary Islands were its mountain peaks. Others thought the Azores were the tips of its drowned palaces. The legend was so potent that it even captured the imagination of one of history's most famous explorers. Christopher Columbus, who meticulously studied geographical texts before his voyage, was deeply influenced by writings that suggested the Atlantic was not an empty void but a sea dotted with islands, and perhaps even a route to the far side of Atlantis. He believed the world was much smaller than it is, and that a journey west would quickly reveal the outer islands of Asia. The ghost of Atlantis, a lost world of immense wealth, provided a powerful subconscious goal, a dream of discovering something far more magnificent than a new trade route, a legendary civilization reborn. While Atlantis was the ancient philosophical phantom, a more immediate and practical specter began to appear on nautical charts in the 15th century, the island of Antilia, also known as the Island of the Seven Cities. Its origin story was a compelling blend of history and myth. According to the tale, when Muslim forces conquered the Iberian Peninsula in the 8th century, 7 Christian bishops fled westward across the Atlantic to save their congregations. They each founded a magnificent city on a large, fertile island, burning their ships to ensure no one would be tempted to return, and vowing to live in isolation until Christianity was restored in their homeland. This story of pious refuge resonated deeply in a Europe engaged in the Reconquista, the centuries-long struggle to push back Muslim rule in Spain and Portugal. Antilia became a symbol of hope and preservation. What's truly remarkable is how this legend transitioned from folklore to official cartography. By the 1400s, Antilia was a standard feature on portolan charts, the detailed maps used by sailors. It was typically drawn as a large, rectangular island far out in the Atlantic, southwest of Portugal. Sailors even reported sightings, a common phenomenon often caused by low-lying clouds or superior mirages that can make distant objects appear to float above the horizon. The myth gained such credibility that in 1492, the same year Columbus set sail, the Pope formally divided the unexplored world between Spain and Portugal in the Treaty of Tordesillas. The treaty's line of demarcation was drawn to grant Spain any lands west of a certain point, and it specifically mentioned that if the legendary island of the Seven Cities was discovered, it would belong to the Spanish crown. A phantom island had just been given legal status by the highest authority in Christendom. The power of this particular myth is literally written on the map of the world today. When Spanish explorers reached the chain of islands bordering the Caribbean Sea, they named them the Antilles, a direct reference to the legendary Antilia. The name stuck, a permanent cartographic monument to a place that never was. These Atlantic phantoms, from the deep-time mystery of Atlantis to the more recent and politically charged Antilia, were not harmless fairy tales. They were active forces in history. They provided specific, tantalizing destinations for explorers. They helped secure funding from monarchs who dreamed of finding new sources of gold and new Christian allies. They gave sailors the courage to venture into the sea of darkness, armed with maps that promised there was anything out there besides an endless, empty ocean. The age of exploration was driven as much by the maps of imaginary lands as it was by the slowly improving maps of real ones. But the Atlantic was not the only direction in which European dreams sailed. If the Western Sea was a canvas for fearsome monsters and sunken empires, then the East was a screen upon which they projected their most fervent hopes for paradise. While the Atlantic represented the terrifying unknown, the Orient represented the alluring unknown, a land rumored to be dripping with gold, spices, and ancient wisdom. It was to the East that the mapmakers turned to chart not one, but two of history's most captivating Edens, one born from classical Greek idealism, and the other from a desperate medieval political fantasy. These were the lands of Hyperborea and the kingdom of Prester John. Our journey to the first of these Eastern Edens takes us not to a warm, tropical locale, but surprisingly into the far, frozen north. According to ancient Greek writers like the historian Herodotus, beyond the domain of Boreas, the god of the north wind, lay a mysterious land called Hyperborea, literally, beyond the north wind. This was not a grim, icy wasteland as we might imagine. The Greeks conceived of it as a place of perpetual sunshine and perfect, idyllic climate, a veritable paradise insulated from the harsh winds and storms that plagued the Mediterranean world. The Hyperboreans were said to be a race of giants, living in a state of perfect happiness and peace, free from disease, old age, and hardship. They were devoted to the god Apollo, who was believed to winter among them, and their lives were a continuous festival of music and dance. This vision is a fascinating example of a mythical geography defined by its opposition to the known world. For the Greeks, the north was a direction of danger and cold. Hyperborea was the miraculous exception, a blessed isle of warmth and light in a sea of imagined frost. Its exact location was always vague. Some placed it in the far north of Europe, others in Asia, but its allure was precise. It was the ultimate utopia, a land where the very laws of nature were suspended to allow for human perfection. It was a geographical expression of a philosophical ideal. While Hyperborea was a peaceful paradise of myth, the second great Eastern Eden was born from a much more urgent and earthly need, the desperate hope for a military ally. In the middle of the 12th century, a letter began to circulate among the courts of Europe, a document that would captivate the continent for over 400 years. It was purportedly from a fabulously wealthy and powerful Christian king known as Prester John. The name Prester is a version of presbyter, meaning priest, casting him as a priest-king who ruled a vast empire. His letter, addressed to the Byzantine emperor, was a breathtaking piece of propaganda. It described a kingdom lost somewhere in the Orient, overflowing with unimaginable wonders. Prester John claimed to rule over 72 other kings, to possess a palace made of crystal and gold, and to have a scepter carved from a single emerald. His realm contained the Fountain of Youth, which restored youth to anyone who bathed in it. It was populated by strange races, including giants, pygmies, and men with horns. Most importantly, he declared his intention to march westward to aid his fellow Christians in their crusades against Muslim forces. The impact of this letter was electric. At a time when Christian crusader states in the Holy Land were under immense pressure, the idea of a mighty Christian ally appearing from the east to crush their enemies was a fantasy too powerful to ignore. The letter was copied and translated repeatedly, its details growing more elaborate with each retelling. It was almost certainly a forgery, likely created by a European cleric to boost morale, but it was taken as absolute fact. For centuries, popes and kings sent emissaries eastward to make contact with Prester John. These missions had a dual purpose: to establish a diplomatic and military alliance, and to explore the mysterious lands of Asia. They were looking for a real place on the map, a kingdom they fully expected to find. As these explorers ventured deeper into Asia, the location of Prester John's kingdom began to shift. When no vast Christian empire was found in India or Central Asia, the legend simply migrated. By the 14th and 15th centuries, as knowledge of Africa increased, Prester John was relocated to that continent. Rumors spread of a powerful Christian king ruling in the highlands of Ethiopia. This was not a complete fiction. Ethiopia was indeed an ancient Christian kingdom, isolated from Europe for centuries. The legend of Prester John fused with the reality of the Ethiopian Negus, or emperor. This fusion had profound real-world consequences. Portuguese explorers like Prince Henry the Navigator were explicitly motivated by the desire to find a sea route to the kingdom of Prester John, hoping to outflank the Muslim powers of North Africa by forging an alliance with this legendary Christian monarch from the south. The quest for Prester John directly drove the Portuguese voyages down the coast of West Africa, a key chapter in the Age of Discovery. The cartographic legacy of this enduring hope is striking. For hundreds of years, maps of Asia and Africa featured the words Regnum Presbyteri Johannis, the kingdom of Prester John. Its location wandered across the parchment, from the depths of India to the heart of Africa, a phantom kingdom that consistently remained just beyond the edge of the latest exploration. It was a place that had to exist because the political and religious needs of Europe demanded it. The story of Prester John is perhaps the ultimate example of a mythical geography created not from poetic allegory, but from sheer desire. It shows us that a map is not just a record of what is there, it is also a record of what we desperately wish to find. The kingdom was a mirage, but the armies, the diplomats, and the ships sent to find it were utterly real, forever altering the course of global history as they searched for an Eastern Eden that lived only in a letter and in the collective imagination of a continent. While the vast continents of Prester John and Atlantis captured the imagination of kings and philosophers, there was another, more intimate category of mythical geography that held a special fascination for sailors and mapmakers: the Phantom Island. These were not sprawling empires or theological paradises, but smaller, more manageable landmasses that appeared with tantalizing consistency on nautical charts. They were the ultimate cartographic ghosts, appearing just often enough to be believed in, yet always vanishing when searched for. They possessed a unique power because they were perfectly scaled for plausibility, small enough to have been missed by previous voyages, yet large enough to promise fresh water, shelter, or even treasure. Among this flotilla of apparitions, 3 islands stand out for their endurance and the sheer number of expeditions they inspired: the Celtic enigma of Hy-Brasil, the Holy Grail of St. Brendan's Isle, and the ultimate northern mystery of Thule. Off the western coast of Ireland, on countless maps from the 14th to the 19th centuries, you would find an island known as Hy-Brasil, often drawn as a perfect circle split by a straight river running through its center. Its name derives from the Gaelic Hy-Brasil, meaning descendants of Bresel, and is rooted in ancient Celtic folklore. This was not an island of gold or monsters, but something more ethereal, a land shrouded in a dense, perpetual mist, said to appear only once every 7 years, visible for just a single day before fading back into the ocean's embrace. Legends described it as a place of advanced beings or a blissful afterlife, a Celtic otherworld tantalizingly close to the familiar shores of Ireland. Its persistence on maps was astounding. Renowned cartographers like the Venetian Angelino Dolcet included it in the 14th century, and the influential Mercator Atlas featured it well into the 16th. So powerful was its legend that when Portuguese explorers reached the shores of South America and found a land rich in a certain red dye wood, they named it Terra do Brasil, after the similar-sounding Pau-Brasil wood. The phantom island of Hy-Brasil had, in a twist of cartographic fate, bestowed its name upon a real country, a permanent echo of a myth on the modern atlas. Across the Atlantic, another holy phantom beckoned explorers westward. St. Brendan's Isle was named for the 6th century Irish monk, St. Brendan the Navigator, whose legendary voyage story, the Navigatio Sancti Brendani, described a 7-year journey across the ocean in a small Currach boat with other monks. The tale is a masterpiece of early Christian literature, filled with encounters with talking birds, pillars of crystal, and island monasteries, all culminating in the discovery of a promised land of the saints, a lush and beautiful island where it was always day and never night. This story, cherished for centuries, transitioned from spiritual allegory to geographical fact. By the age of discovery, St. Brendan's Isle was a standard feature on maps, typically placed west of the Canary Islands. It became a primary goal for explorers. The Portuguese crown explicitly tasked explorers with finding it, and the famous Genos navigator Christopher Columbus noted the legend in his own journals, wondering if the lands he had found were connected to the saints' discovery. As late as the 18th century, British ships were still being sent to search for the island, and it was only officially removed from British Admiralty charts in the year 1873. The quest for St. Brendan's Isle demonstrates how a deeply spiritual story could provide a concrete, motivating goal for exploration, blending the hope for divine revelation with the very earthly desire for discovery. Further north, in the cold, swirling mists of the Arctic, lay the most ancient and debated phantom of all, Thule. First mentioned by the Greek explorer Pytheas of Massalia around 320 years before the Common Era, Thule was described as the northernmost inhabited land, a place where the sun barely set in summer. The sea became a thick, sluggish slush, and the elements defied normal understanding. Pytheas's original account is lost, but his descriptions, repeated by later geographers like Strabo, were so vague and extraordinary that Thule became a blank slate for the imagination. For centuries, its location was a subject of intense scholarly debate. The Roman geographer Pomponius Mela placed it north of Britain. Some later thinkers argued it was Iceland, which would have been a logical candidate given its volcanic activity and midnight sun. Others believed it was Norway, the Shetland Islands, or even the Faroe Islands. The mystery of Thule was its defining characteristic. It was not a place with a specific mythology of its own, but rather a concept, the ultimate edge of the habitable world. It represented the absolute limit of exploration, the point beyond which human civilization could not exist. This idea was so powerful that the name, Ultima Thule, came to signify any distant, unknown goal lying at the very frontier of knowledge. Even when Iceland and Scandinavia were thoroughly mapped, the ghost of Pytheas's Thule lingered, a symbol of the eternal human drive to push just a little further, to see what lies beyond the next horizon. These island phantoms, from the misty shores of Hy-Brasil to the sacred ground of St. Brendan and the icy frontier of Thule, were more than just cartographic errors. They were hypotheses. Each one represented a question asked by the mapmaker. What if it's here? That question, repeated over generations, was enough to launch 1,000 ships into the unknown, proving that sometimes the most powerful force in exploration is not the certainty of a destination, but the thrilling possibility of a mirage. But a map is more than just coastlines and mountains. It is also a portrait of the people who are believed to inhabit the world. And on the edges of the medieval and Renaissance map, where the parchment faded into the unknown, cartographers populated the blank spaces with some of the most astonishing beings ever conceived by the human imagination. These were not the dragons and sea serpents that warned of environmental dangers, but entire races of people whose very bodies defied the laws of nature. They were the monstrous races, and their presence on the map forced a profound and troubling question. What exactly does it mean to be human? These figures were not born from the wild fantasies of a lonely monk. They came from the most respected authorities of the ancient world, meticulously catalogued by Roman scholars like Pliny the Elder. When a medieval mapmaker drew a cynocephalus, a man with the head of a dog who communicated in barks, he was not doodling. He was citing a classical text, treating it with the same seriousness a modern cartographer might treat a satellite survey. Alongside the dog-headed men were the Blemii, a tribe whose faces were embedded in their chests, looking out from a torso devoid of a head. There were the Cyopods or monopods who possessed a single, gigantic foot, which they used to hop at great speed and also as a parasol to shade themselves from the sun. And perhaps most bizarre of all were the Ostomi, a people who had no mouths and sustained themselves solely by smelling apples and fragrant flowers, a diet that rendered them vulnerable to any foul odor. These were just a few entries in a vast encyclopedia of the human form gone wonderfully, terribly strange. The inclusion of these beings was not merely an act of recording strange tales. It was a fundamental part of a theological and anthropological debate that raged for centuries. If these creatures existed, as the authoritative texts claimed, then Christian scholars had to grapple with their place in God's creation. The central, haunting question was this: did these monstrous races have souls? Were they, like the descendants of Adam and Eve, eligible for salvation? This was not an abstract philosophical puzzle. It had real-world consequences for exploration, conquest, and conversion. If these beings were considered human, then they were potential converts to Christianity, and European contact would be framed through missionary work. But if they were seen as monstrous aberrations outside the family of man, then they could be treated as animals or even threats to be eliminated. Some theologians, like St. Augustine, argued for a broad definition of humanity, suggesting that even if their bodies were strange, they could still be rational beings descended from Adam. Others were far less charitable, viewing their monstrous forms as a sign of divine disfavor or even a demonic lineage. This debate was mapped onto the geography of the world itself. The placement of these races was never random. They were almost always located in the farthest reaches of Africa or the deepest parts of Asia, on the very periphery of the known world. This was a deliberate act of cartographic ordering. By placing the monstrous at the edges, the mapmaker was creating a powerful visual hierarchy. At the center of the map, you typically found Jerusalem, the spiritual heart of the Christian world. Radiating out from that center were the familiar lands of Europe, populated by people who looked and lived like the mapmaker himself. Then, further out, were the less familiar but still recognizable civilizations of Islam and the East. And finally, at the muddy, ill-defined edges were the monstrous races. This spatial arrangement reinforced a potent idea that normality, civilization, and true humanity were centered in Europe, and that the further one traveled from that center, the more the world and its people devolved into chaos and monstrosity. In this way, the map became a tool for defining the self by defining the other. The European identity of being civilized and normal was constructed in direct opposition to the monstrous savagery imagined to exist at the world's edges. The dog-headed man and the headless blemmie served as a mirror, but a distorted one. By looking at these reflections of the human form made alien, Europeans could reassure themselves of their own place at the pinnacle of God's creation. This was not just innocent curiosity. It was a form of ideological justification that would later be used to underpin colonial expansion. When European explorers finally did encounter the diverse peoples of sub-Saharan Africa and the Americas, they often filtered their perceptions through this centuries-old lens of the monstrous races. The unfamiliar clothing, body paint, and cultural practices of indigenous peoples were sometimes interpreted as evidence that they had indeed found the dog-headed men or other monstrous tribes from the old maps. This pre-existing framework made it easier to dehumanize entire populations, to see them not as fellow humans with rich and complex cultures, but as living embodiments of the monstrous other from medieval legend. The practice of mapping these races reveals that cartography is never a neutral science. It is always a cultural act laden with the biases, fears, and aspirations of the society that produces it. Drawing a blemmie in the heart of Africa was more than just filling a blank space. It was an act of defining humanity itself, of drawing a literal and figurative boundary around who belongs and who does not. These maps told a story about the world, but they also told a story about the mapmakers, revealing a deep-seated need to organize the overwhelming diversity of human existence into a manageable hierarchical order, with themselves firmly and reassuringly at the center. Yet while European monks were sketching their world centered on Jerusalem, a vibrant and intellectually daring cartographic revolution was unfolding far to the south under the banner of Islam. From the 8th century onwards, the Abbasid Caliphate, stretching from Spain to the borders of India, became the world's unrivaled center of scientific learning. In the legendary House of Wisdom in Baghdad, scholars gathered not to burn ancient knowledge, but to preserve and expand it, translating the works of Greek thinkers like Ptolemy into Arabic and building upon their foundations with meticulous new observations. This created a tradition of mapmaking that was, in many ways, far more scientific and systematic than what was being produced in Europe at the same time. Yet this scientific rigor did not mean the maps were devoid of wonder. Islamic cartography presents a fascinating duality, a disciplined pursuit of accuracy, seamlessly blended with a rich tapestry of cosmological belief and mythical geography, proving that the human need to map the marvelous was a truly universal impulse. To understand this unique approach, we can look to one of its greatest masters, the 12th century geographer Abu Abdullah Al-Idrisi. In a remarkable story of cross-cultural collaboration, Al-Idrisi, a Muslim scholar from North Africa, was commissioned by the Christian Norman King Roger II of Sicily to create the most accurate world map ever known. For 15 years, Al-Idrisi and a team of scholars synthesized everything they could gather. They pored over the texts of Ptolemy, interviewed traveling merchants and explorers, and incorporated the first-hand accounts of Roger's own navigators. The result was the Tabula Rogeriana, or the Book of Roger, completed in 1154. This was not a single map but a massive work containing 70 sectional maps that, when combined, created a detailed representation of the known world. Its orientation placed south at the top, a common practice in Islamic cartography that reflected the direction of prayer, or Qibla, for many Muslim communities north of Mecca. The map was astonishingly precise for its time, depicting the sources of the Nile with surprising accuracy and showing a clear understanding of the shape of Asia. It was a monument to empirical inquiry, but even Al-Idrisi's scientific masterpiece was not a purely modern atlas. Woven into its carefully researched coastlines were elements of the mythical and the divine, drawn from Islamic cosmology and folklore. One central concept was that of the encircling ocean, known as al-Bahr al-Muhit. Islamic geographers, like their Greek predecessors, believed the known continents of Africa, Europe, and Asia were surrounded by a vast, impassable body of water. Beyond this ocean lay the Al-Jazirat al-Makouka, or the created island, a realm of unknown lands that existed in a state of perpetual twilight, untouched by human exploration. This was not merely an empty space, it was a defined, conceptual space that represented the absolute limit of the created world, a boundary set by divine will. Its inclusion on maps served a similar purpose to the dragons on European charts. It marked the edge of the knowable, a cartographic acknowledgement of a world much larger and more mysterious than any human could fully comprehend. Perhaps the most evocative mythical geography in the Islamic tradition was the range of mountains known as Mount Kaf. In cosmological belief, this was not a simple mountain chain but a vast emerald ring that encircled the entire world. It was said to be the foundation of the earth, the point where the physical realm met the celestial. Legends held that the mystical bird, the simurgh, nested in its peaks, and that it was the home of powerful jinn, beings created from smokeless fire. The mountains of Kaf functioned in a way strikingly similar to the Greek titan Atlas, who was condemned to hold up the celestial spheres. Both were mythical structures that explained the physical support and boundaries of the cosmos. On Islamic maps, the presence of Kaf, either explicitly drawn or implicitly understood, provided a spiritual and cosmological framework. It transformed the map from a flat representation of land and sea into a vertical diagram of creation, connecting the earth to the heavens above. This blending of the empirical and the mythical was not a contradiction for Islamic scholars. It was a harmonious whole. Their goal was to create a complete picture of God's creation, which included both the measurable realities of geography and the spiritual truths revealed through scripture and tradition. The world was Allah's creation, and to map it was an act of devotion, an attempt to understand the majesty and complexity of his design. This meant that a mountain range described in a sacred text could hold as much cartographic weight as a coastline reported by a sailor. The Islamic cartographic tradition, therefore, offers a crucial correction to a simplistic historical narrative. It demonstrates that the impulse to map the mythical was not a sign of European ignorance or a peculiarity of the Christian worldview. It was a shared human endeavor. From the House of Wisdom in Baghdad to the scriptoriums of medieval Europe, from the court of King Roger in Sicily to the monasteries that produced the Hereford Mappa Mundi, humans in every culture and creed have used the language of maps to tell the most important stories they know, stories about where we come from, what lies beyond the horizon, and our own place within the vast, wondrous, often mysterious cosmos. For centuries, the world map had been a stable, almost sacred document, its edges guarded by dragons and its empty oceans adorned with the islands of saints and legends. It was a picture of the world as it was believed to be, a comforting narrative of faith and ancient authority. But then the ships began to sail, not the coastal traders of old, but sturdy, ocean-going caravels and naus pushing further and further into the void. This was the dawn of the Age of Discovery, a period of unprecedented exploration that would not just add new details to the map, but would tear the old parchment to shreds and force humanity to redraw its entire understanding of the planet. This was the seismic shift from a geography of myth to a geography of measurement, and it was one of the most profound and disorienting intellectual revolutions in human history. The process began gradually, like cracks appearing in a once solid wall. Portuguese explorers, driven by the dream of reaching the riches of the East by sea and the enduring hope of finding Prester John, meticulously worked their way down the west coast of Africa. For generations, European maps had shown this region as a vague, monster-filled shore that eventually curved east to connect with Asia, enclosing the Indian Ocean as a giant lake. But the Portuguese captains like Bartolomeu Dias, who rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, brought back irrefutable evidence. The African coast did not curve east, it continued south and then swung north again, revealing an open sea route to the Indian Ocean. In a single voyage, a fundamental pillar of the ancient worldview, inherited from Ptolemy himself, was shattered. The Indian Ocean was not a landlocked sea, it was a gateway to a vast, interconnected world. Then came the thunderclap of 1492. When Christopher Columbus returned from his voyage across the Atlantic, he believed he had reached the outer islands of Asia. He was looking for Cipangu, or Japan, and the court of the Great Khan, places that existed on the maps derived from Marco Polo's travels. But what he had actually found was something far more cataclysmic for the old geography, an entirely new continent, a landmass completely unknown to the authorities of the Bible and the classical world. This was not just a new island like Antilia, this was a world unto itself. Subsequent voyages by Amerigo Vespucci and others confirmed the horrifying, exhilarating truth. This was not the edge of Asia. It was something else entirely, a new world that had no place in the established story. The comforting, enclosed world of the medieval Mundi was suddenly, violently, blown wide open. The map now had a gigantic, unexplained hole in the middle of the ocean, a hole that was rapidly filling with the strange, unexpected shapes of North and South America. This new knowledge was deeply traumatic for the European psyche. Imagine the vertigo of discovering that your most fundamental understanding of your own home, the Earth, was fundamentally wrong. Theologians scrambled to explain how these new lands and their people fit into the biblical narrative. Were these inhabitants also descendants of Adam and Eve? If so, how had they traveled across the vast ocean? The very location of the earthly paradise, once fixed with certainty at the top of the map, was suddenly thrown into doubt. If the East was now reachable by sailing west, then the entire spiritual geography of the world was up for grabs. The authority of the Church and the classical authors, the twin pillars of knowledge for a millennium, were severely undermined. The world was no longer a known quantity with a few mysterious edges. It had become a place of shocking, almost limitless, and deeply unsettling possibility. The cartographers of the age found themselves on the front lines of this revolution. Their workshop tables became battlegrounds between the old and the new. They were inundated with new data sketches from ships' pilots, rutters, or navigation logs, and detailed portolan charts from returning explorers. Their task was to incorporate this flood of empirical evidence into a cartographic tradition built on myth. The result was a period of glorious, chaotic, and often contradictory mapmaking. You can see the tension etched onto the parchment. A map from the early 16th century might show a reasonably accurate coastline for the Caribbean, based on the latest Spanish charts, while still clinging to the phantom island of Antilia floating nearby. The island of Hy-Brasil might be drawn off the coast of Ireland, even as the overall shape of Africa is rendered with surprising precision. Cartographers were reluctant to fully let go of the old myths. These places had been on maps for centuries. Their removal felt like an act of vandalism against a cherished story. It took generations of failed expeditions, of sailors returning with the same report, nothing there but empty sea, for a phantom island like Antilia to finally, reluctantly, be erased from the official charts. Each erasure was a small death, the end of a dream that had guided explorers for generations. This tension between faith and fact, between the authority of the text and the evidence of the eye, marked the birth of the modern scientific mindset. The map was transforming from a spiritual document into a practical tool. The new maps, like the groundbreaking world map of Gerardus Mercator in 1569, were designed not for theological contemplation, but for navigation. Mercator's projection, which allowed a sailor to plot a straight line as a constant compass bearing, was a masterpiece of utilitarian design. It prioritized function over form, accuracy over narrative. This was the ultimate triumph of measurement over myth. The goal was no longer to illustrate God's plan, but to get a ship from Lisbon to Goa as efficiently and safely as possible. The monsters were gradually pushed out of the oceans and into the decorative cartouches around the map's edges, becoming mere artistic flourishes rather than features of the geography itself. The impact of this shift cannot be overstated. It changed humanity's relationship with the planet forever. The world was no longer a story to be read, but a puzzle to be solved through observation, measurement, and exploration. The unknown was no longer a divine mystery to be filled with angels and monsters, but a series of concrete problems to be overcome, calculating longitude, mapping currents, charting winds. This new, empirical approach unleashed a torrent of discovery that would eventually lead to a complete, if not perfectly accurate, map of the globe. But something was lost in this great unveiling. The sense of wonder, the thrilling possibility that the next voyage might not just find a new trade route, but might stumble upon the fountain of youth or the kingdom of Prester John, began to fade. The world became smaller, more known, and in some ways less magical. The age of discovery did not just fill in the blank spaces on the map. It initiated a fundamental reorientation of the human spirit, from a posture of faithful acceptance to one of relentless, questioning inquiry. The dragons had not been slain, they had simply been measured and found wanting. Yet, for all the triumphs of empirical discovery, the old myths refused to vanish quietly into the archives. The age of discovery was less a clean break and more a long, stubborn struggle between emerging fact and entrenched fiction. Even as the true contours of the Americas and the Pacific came into focus, certain phantom lands clung to the maps with a tenacity that seems baffling to our modern minds. These were the diehards of mythical geography, places like the island of Friesland and the terrifying Isle of Demons, which managed to persist on reputable charts well into the 17th and even 18th centuries. Their stubborn survival reveals a crucial truth about the human psyche. That belief, once mapped, develops a powerful inertia that can resist even the most compelling contradictory evidence. Consider the curious case of Friesland, a sizable phantom island that appeared southeast of Iceland on numerous maps throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. Its origins are a perfect storm of cartographic error and opportunistic reinvention. The story likely begins with the Zeno brothers, Venetian nobles who claimed to have sailed the North Atlantic in the late 14th century. Their account, published in 1558, included a map featuring an island called Friesland. Historians now believe the brothers may have simply misidentified the Shetland Islands or the Faroe Islands, perhaps due to bad weather or navigational miscalculation. But once this discovery was in print, it took on a life of its own. The island was quickly adopted by other mapmakers, including the influential Gerardus Mercator. Its presence became a problem for later explorers. When the English navigator Martin Frobisher sailed in 1576, he encountered a landmass he believed was Friesland, but which was almost certainly the southern coast of Greenland. In a classic feedback loop of error, Frobisher's confirmation of Friesland's existence only reinforced its place on the map for another 100 years. Mapmakers working in their studies far from the treacherous northern seas were often compilers rather than explorers. They relied heavily on copying from earlier, respected sources. To remove a feature that had been present on maps by respected figures like Mercator was a bold step, requiring definitive proof of its absence, proof that was incredibly difficult to obtain in an age of imperfect navigation. Friesland persisted not because anyone could prove it was there, but because no one could definitively prove it wasn't. beyond simple error, the very environment of the open ocean conspired to create phantoms. Sailors' reports of seeing distant, shimmering lands were often fueled by a fascinating and real atmospheric phenomenon known as a superior mirage, or fata morgana. This complex mirage occurs when temperature gradients in the atmosphere bend light, distorting or elevating distant objects. A low-lying cloud bank on the horizon could be transformed into the appearance of majestic cliffs and forested hills. An iceberg glimpsed from a distance through a heat haze might look like a rugged island. For a weary crew months at sea, the vision of land was a powerful psychological trigger. These mirages were not hallucinations, they were convincing optical illusions often witnessed by multiple members of a crew. When a ship's log recorded a sighting of, say, the Isle of Demons, a place off the coast of Newfoundland said to be haunted by evil spirits, it was frequently based on a genuine, shared visual experience. The mirage provided the evidence, and the pre-existing myth on the map provided the explanation. It was easier to believe you had glimpsed a haunted island that was supposed to be there than to accept that the sea itself was capable of such profound and cruel deception. The persistence of these myths was also fueled by something far more pragmatic than mirages or copying errors: sheer human ambition. The competition for royal patronage and national prestige in the age of exploration was fierce. An explorer who returned from a voyage claiming to have discovered a new, potentially resource-rich island could secure fame, fortune, and funding for his next expedition. This created a powerful incentive to see, or at least to report, what mapmakers and monarchs expected to see: the phantom island of Bus, supposedly discovered by an English ship of the same name in the North Atlantic in 1578, is a prime example. Despite no other ship ever being able to find it, Bus Island remained on charts for nearly 2 centuries because its reported existence served various interests. It gave England a claimed territory in contested northern waters, and it gave later explorers a reason to seek funding for voyages to rediscover it. In a world where accurate longitude measurement was still impossible, it was remarkably easy for a captain to return from a failed search for a phantom island and simply blame strong currents or poor weather for his inability to find it again. The myth, in such cases, was protected by a shield of plausible deniability and vested interest. Ultimately, the long, slow death of these cartographic phantoms teaches us that maps are not just records of geographical reality, they are also records of cultural memory. A mythical geography that has been part of a civilization's world view for generations becomes a story that people are emotionally and intellectually invested in. Letting go of Friesland or the Isle of Demons was not merely a technical correction. It was the abandonment of a narrative, the closing of a chapter of possibility. It required a fundamental shift in how knowledge was validated, from trusting the authority of ancient texts and respected predecessors to trusting the direct, verifiable observations of explorers. This was a slow and uneven process. The final erasure of a phantom island from the map was a quiet admission that the world was, in fact, knowable, measurable, and ultimately finite. It marked the end of a certain kind of mystery, a surrender to the fact that the age of dragons on the parchment was finally, irrevocably, over. While the age of discovery was steadily shrinking the world, erasing phantom islands one by one from the nautical charts, there remained one colossal blank space that refused to be filled with anything but the grandest of dreams. At the very bottom of every world map, a vast, shadowy shape often stretched across the entire southern hemisphere. It was labeled with a name that whispered of ultimate discovery: Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. This was not a mere island, but a continent, imagined to be so immense that it balanced the entire planet. The search for this final phantom would become the greatest geographical wild goose chase in history, a quest that would consume the ambitions of nations and the lives of explorers for over 300 years, driven by a theory that was as elegant as it was completely wrong. The seeds of this epic misconception were sown not in the age of sail, but in the libraries of ancient Greece. Greek philosophers, observing the world they knew, developed a profound belief in symmetry and balance. They noted that the great landmasses of Europe, Asia, and North Africa were all clustered in the northern hemisphere. To their logical minds, this arrangement seemed unstable. How could the world be in equilibrium if all the weight was on one side? The great thinker Aristotle himself proposed a principle of balance. The known continents in the north must be counterbalanced by an equally large landmass in the south. This wasn't just a geographical hunch, it was a cosmological necessity. They called this hypothetical counterweight the antipodes, a land literally on the opposite side of the feet. This elegant theory, born from pure reason rather than observation, was so compelling that it became an unshakable article of faith for generations of geographers to come. This classical idea was revived and supercharged during the Renaissance, as European mapmakers began to synthesize the new discoveries in the Americas with the rediscovered works of Ptolemy and other ancients. The concept of Terra Australis found a new and prominent place on their world maps. It was often depicted as a massive, bulbous continent, connected to the southern tip of South America by a thin sliver of land and sweeping eastwards to encompass the entire bottom of the globe. Its imagined geography was a cartographer's paradise. It was believed to be a land of immense wealth and temperate climate, a virtual paradise. Since the known southern lands like Africa and South America grew hotter as one traveled north, it was reasoned that this undiscovered southern continent would enjoy a perfect Mediterranean-like climate. It was speculated to be rich in gold, spices, and all the treasures that had fueled the exploration of the Indies. It was the ultimate prize, a blank canvas upon which every European power could project its wildest colonial fantasies. This belief was so powerful that it began to distort the interpretation of actual discoveries. When the Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan first navigated the treacherous strait at the southern tip of South America in 1520, he named it the Strait of Magellan. On the southern side, he saw the barren, cold shores of a land he called Tierra del Fuego, the land of fire, for the lights of indigenous campfires he observed. Many cartographers, however, refused to see this as a mere archipelago. In their minds, this had to be the northernmost peninsula of the great Terra Australis. For centuries, maps showed Tierra del Fuego as part of that gigantic continent. Similarly, when the Dutch explorer Abel Tasman discovered the island that would later be named Tasmania, and later still sighted the shores of New Zealand in 1642, he believed he had found the western coast of the legendary continent. His report sent a wave of excitement through Europe. The great southern land, it seemed, was finally within reach. The hunt was now officially on. The British, the French, and the Dutch all launched expeditions with the explicit goal of finding and claiming Terra Australis. It was during this fervent period that the British Admiralty chose one of its most capable and determined officers, Captain James Cook, for the most ambitious voyage of discovery yet conceived. When Cook set sail on his first Pacific voyage in 1768 aboard the H.M. bark Endeavour, his secret instructions from the Admiralty were unequivocal. He was to sail south from Tahiti in search of the fabled continent. The instructions stated, "There is reason to imagine that a continent or land of great extent may be found to the southward." Cook was to chart its coasts, cultivate relations with its inhabitants, and claim any convenient harbors for the British Crown. What Cook found, however, was not a lush paradise. Sailing further south than any European had ever ventured, he and his crew encountered not a temperate shoreline, but the terrifying, magnificent reality of the Southern Ocean. They faced monstrous waves, freezing fog, and vast fields of pack ice. He circumnavigated New Zealand, proving it was a large pair of islands and not attached to a greater continent. He then sailed along the eastern coast of Australia, which, while vast, was clearly not the legendary landmass that stretched across the pole. On his second voyage, equipped with 2 ships, the Resolution and the Adventure, Cook embarked on an even more daring mission. Between 1772 and 1775, he performed a feat of navigation that still inspires awe. He crossed the Antarctic Circle not once but 3 times, pushing his ships through perilous icebergs and brutal cold. At one point, he reached a latitude of 71 degrees south, a record that would stand for decades, but all he found was an endless, frozen desert of ice. He wrote in his journal, "I firmly believe that there is a tract of land near the pole which is the source of most of the ice which is spread over this vast southern ocean." But he also concluded with devastating finality that even if such a land existed, it would be condemned to everlasting rigidity by nature and never be yielding to the warmth of the sun. Cook's voyages were a masterpiece of exploration, but they were also a funeral for a dream. He had not merely failed to find Terra Australis, he had proven that the continent, as it had been imagined for centuries, a wealthy, populous, temperate land, was a fantasy. The symmetrical, balanced world of the ancient Greeks was a beautiful illusion. The reality was a cold, harsh, and asymmetric planet. The true southern continent, Antarctica, was indeed there, but it was a frozen wilderness, utterly inaccessible and inhospitable to the ambitions of empire. Cook's meticulous charts replaced the shadowy outline of Terra Australis with the stark, empty expanse of the Southern Ocean. The quest for the great southern land represents the final, definitive chapter in the age of large-scale mythical geography. It was the last time a civilization would send its greatest explorers across the globe in search of a place that existed primarily in the elegant equations of philosophers and the hopeful speculations of mapmakers. The dream of balance was dashed against the unforgiving ice of reality, closing a 1,000-year era where the map was drawn as much by logic and desire as by latitude and longitude. So we have traced the long, slow retreat of these cartographic phantoms, watching as the steady advance of empirical discovery pushed the dragons and the lost islands to the very margins of the map. But to see this process as a simple triumph of fact over fiction would be to miss the most profound point of all, because for centuries it was the fiction that called the tune. These non-existent geographies were not merely decorative errors or harmless superstitions. They were the very fuel in the engines of exploration. They provided the objectives, secured the funding, and perhaps most importantly, furnished the psychological courage necessary for men to sail into a literal void. The history of exploration is, in many ways, a history of chasing ghosts, and those phantoms left an indelible mark on the real world we inhabit today. Consider the very practical mechanics of launching an expedition in the 15th or 16th century. A captain could not simply approach a monarch and say, "Your Majesty, I have a feeling there might be something interesting out there in the vast, empty ocean." That was a recipe for a denied petition and a one-way ticket to the dungeon. To secure royal patronage, an explorer needed a specific, compelling, and believable goal. The mythical geographies provided a perfect script. When Prince Henry, the navigator of Portugal, sent his caravels down the coast of Africa, he was driven by a complex mix of motives, a desire for trade, yes, but also a powerful religious and strategic imperative to contact the legendary Prester John. The existence of this powerful Christian king, a potential ally against Islamic powers, was not a vague hope, it was a geographical fact on the maps of the time. This belief transformed a speculative voyage into a strategic diplomatic mission, justifying the immense investment of lives and treasure. The myth provided a concrete destination, a reason to believe that the immense risks were worth the potential reward of forging an alliance that could change the balance of power in the known world. This pattern repeats itself with stunning clarity in the most famous voyage of all. Christopher Columbus was a man steeped in the geographical texts of his day, from the travels of Marco Polo to the classical works of Ptolemy. His famous proposal to sail west to reach the east was built upon a foundation of both real miscalculation and powerful myth. He believed the world was significantly smaller than it is, but he also believed in the existence of the phantom islands that dotted the Atlantic on his charts. Antilia, the island of the seven cities, was not just a story to him. It was a potential stopping point, a way station on the route to Cipangu or Japan and the court of the Great Khan. His copies of these maps, which he annotated meticulously, show a mind actively planning a journey through a landscape of legend. When he finally made landfall in the Caribbean, his first thought was not that he had discovered a new world, but that he had reached the outer islands of Asia. He was looking for the places his mythical maps had promised him, and he interpreted everything he saw through that filter. The lure of these mapped phantoms was the essential catalyst that got his ships funded and out of the harbor. Without that cartographic fantasy providing a seemingly rational goal, his audacious plan might have been dismissed as pure madness. Beyond providing specific destinations, these myths also shaped the very routes and directions of exploration. The centuries-long, tragic quest for the Northwest Passage is a perfect example. European powers were desperate for a faster sea route to the riches of Asia that bypassed the dangerous and controlled routes around Africa and South America. This desperation gave birth to another potent geographical myth, the belief in an open polar sea. Theorists argued that beyond the ring of pack ice at the Arctic Circle, there lay a temperate, navigable ocean surrounding the North Pole. This idea was based on flawed logic, such as the notion that the midnight sun would melt the ice, but it was championed by influential figures and appeared on maps for generations. This myth sent countless expeditions from Martin Frobisher to Sir John Franklin into the most brutal conditions on Earth. They were not just exploring, they were searching for a geographical phantom, a shortcut that existed only in theory. The belief in the open polar sea directly determined the direction of Arctic exploration for over 300 years, a relentless push into the ice fueled by a cartographic dream. The tragic fate of many of these explorers stands as a stark testament to the power of a compelling myth to override even the most obvious evidence of a harsh reality. The courage required to undertake these journeys is almost unimaginable to us today. To set sail in a wooden ship with only the most rudimentary navigation into an ocean that your charts populated with sea serpents and your culture's lore described as the Sea of Darkness required a special kind of psychology. The mythical geographies provided a crucial psychological service here as well, by giving a name and a form to the unknown, even if that form was a monster or a phantom island. The maps made the terrifying void seem just a little more manageable. It is far less frightening to face a named danger like the Isle of Demons than to confront a formless, silent, and infinite abyss. The maps told the sailors that the unknown had a geography, that it could be charted, and that it contained places, even if they were dangerous or miraculous. This narrative imposed a sense of order on the chaos of the deep ocean. The explorers were not sailing into nothingness, they were sailing towards something, and that fundamental belief, however fictional, was likely the difference between turning back and pressing forward into the face of fear and uncertainty. So, would the pace and direction of exploration have been the same without these mythical goals? The evidence suggests a resounding no. The search for Prester John focused European attention south and east. The dream of Antilia and a western route to the Spice Islands pulled exploration decisively westward across the Atlantic. The belief in the open polar sea channeled immense resources and human effort due north. These were not random vectors of discovery. They were arrows shot towards specific targets on a map, targets that were, in the end, mirages. But in shooting for those mirages, the explorers stumbled upon something far more valuable, the true shape of the world. They found the real coasts of Africa, the unexpected continents of the Americas, and the frozen deserts of the Arctic. The fictional goals provided the initial momentum, the reason to launch the ships. Once at sea, the skill, bravery, and observational power of the explorers took over, gradually replacing the mythical geography with an empirical one. But that empirical map is, in a very real sense, a byproduct of the quest for fantasy. The modern world, with its interconnected continents and global awareness, was fundamentally shaped by the human desire to find places that never existed. The greatest discoveries were often accidental, the unintended consequences of a voyage launched in pursuit of a beautiful, compelling, and utterly fictional map. But the influence of these charted fantasies did not end when the last phantom island was erased from the nautical charts. In fact, that is precisely when their second life began. As the world map became standardized and the blank spaces filled with the sobering reality of coastlines and currents, the human need for the wondrous and the unknown simply migrated. It found a new home in a realm with even fewer constraints than the open ocean, the boundless landscape of literature. The same mythical geographies that once guided explorers now began to guide the pens of poets, satirists, and storytellers, providing a powerful vocabulary for social critique, philosophical exploration, and ultimately, the birth of modern fantasy. This literary transformation is perfectly captured in a single, brilliant word, utopia. In 1516, the English statesman and scholar Thomas More published his fictional travelogue about an ideal society on a distant island. He gave this place a name that was a masterful pun, a wink to the educated reader. Utopia can be derived from the Greek eutopos, meaning good place, but also from utopos, meaning no place. With this single name, More was directly engaging with the cartographic tradition we have been exploring. His utopia was a detailed, mapped entity with a specific geography, a social structure, and laws. It felt as real as Antilia or Hy-Brasil on a parchment map. Yet, by calling it no place, More was making a profound point. He was satirizing the political and social ills of his own time by holding up a mirror in the form of an imaginary land, much like Plato used Atlantis for philosophical purposes. Utopia was not a destination to be sought by ships. It was an idea to be pursued by the mind. It launched an entire genre of literature, the Utopian novel, which used the device of a discovered, perfect society to critique the imperfections of the real world. The mapmaker's technique of placing a moral or philosophical ideal in a specific, albeit fictional, location had been perfectly adapted for social commentary. If More used the form for earnest critique, later writers would wield it as a weapon of razor-sharp satire. A century and a half after Utopia, Jonathan Swift sent his hero, Lemuel Gulliver, on a series of voyages in his 1726 masterpiece, Gulliver's Travels. Swift was lampooning the popular travel narratives of his day, which were still filled with exaggerated accounts of exotic lands, but he was also taking direct aim at the legacy of the monstrous races from the old maps. When Gulliver arrives in the land of the Brobdingnagians, he is dwarfed by giants, a literalization of the tales of gigantic races said to live in remote corners of the world. In the kingdom of Lilliput, he is a giant among tiny people, most pointedly on the island of Laputa, a flying land inhabited by absurdly impractical intellectuals, and in the land of the Howitnums, where rational horses rule over brutish, human-like yahoos, Swift savagely satirizes the follies of science, politics, and human nature itself. Gulliver's Travels is a direct descendant of the medieval Mappa Mundi. It populates its fictional geography with strange beings not to fill a blank space, but to hold a distorted mirror up to European society, exposing its hypocrisy, its vanity, and its cruelty. The monstrous races were no longer out there on the edge of the map. Swift was arguing they were right here, disguised as politicians, scholars, and everyday people. This tradition of weaving mythical geographies into the fabric of storytelling was not confined to new inventions. It also infused the great works of the English literary canon. Edmund Spenser's epic poem, The Faerie Queene, is a sprawling allegory set in a fantastical landscape that is both a mythical version of Britain and a moral universe. Its forests, castles, and caves are not random settings. They are symbolic locations where knights representing holiness, temperance, and chastity battle monsters representing vice and error. The geography itself is part of the story, much like the spiritual landscape of the Hereford Mappa Mundi. Even William Shakespeare, whose plays are grounded in human emotion, frequently relies on these cultural touchstones. The setting for The Tempest is an enchanted island, a place of magic and mystery somewhere in the Mediterranean, ruled by the sorcerer Prospero. This island, like St. Brendan's Isle or the land of the Lotus Eaters, is a space outside the normal rules of society, where characters are shipwrecked and transformed. These literary worlds demonstrate that the concept of a mythical geography had become a fundamental storytelling tool, a way to create a stage where the grand dramas of morality, power, and identity could be played out with greater freedom and symbolic power. This rich legacy culminates in the 20th century with the rise of a new form, high fantasy. The foundational worlds of this genre are unthinkable without the centuries of tradition we have explored. J.R.R. Tolkien, a scholar of Anglo-Saxon and Norse mythology, did not just write a story. He created an entire world, Middle-earth, complete with its own meticulously detailed maps, languages, and thousands of years of history. Middle-earth is not a hidden island on our world. It is presented as a mythical past of our own planet. Tolkien's maps of the Shire, Mordor, and Gondor function exactly like the maps of ancient cartographers. They give the world a tangible reality, making the reader feel like they could, in theory, trace the Fellowship's journey from Hobbiton to Mount Doom. Similarly, C.S. Lewis's Narnia is accessed through a magical portal, a hidden world with its own geography, from the lamp post in the snowy wood to the castle of Cair Paravel on the eastern sea. Lewis populates Narnia with talking beasts, dwarves, and witches, creatures that would have been right at home on the edges of a medieval map. The connection is more than superficial. These modern mythmakers were directly inspired by the same sources that fueled the old cartographers. Tolkien's sense of a lost, golden age echoes the legend of Atlantis. The monstrous races he creates, orcs, trolls, elves, are a thoughtful reimagining of the creatures that once populated the Terra Incognita. The act of mapping these worlds is crucial to their appeal. It satisfies the same deep-seated human desire for a coherent, knowable universe, even if that universe is fictional. When we pore over the map of Middle-earth, we are participating in the exact same cognitive process as a medieval scholar studying the Hereford Mappa Mundi. We are using spatial understanding to navigate a narrative, to orient ourselves within a story that is larger than life. The legacy of mythical cartography is not a dusty relic. It is the very bedrock of the multi-billion-dollar fantasy industry today, from the mapped worlds of George R. R. Martin's Westeros to the sprawling continents of video games like the Elder Scrolls. These modern imaginary worlds are our collective here-be-dragons, proof that the human impulse to map the landscapes of our imagination is as vital and compelling as ever. This deep-seated need to chart the unknown, to populate the void with meaning, is far more than a historical curiosity. It is a fundamental feature of the human operating system, a psychological imperative hardwired into our cognition. The same impulse that led a medieval monk to carefully illustrate the Garden of Eden at the top of a parchment is the very same force that drives a child to build an elaborate fort out of couch cushions, or an adult to spend hundreds of hours exploring the digital continent of Tamriel in the Elder Scrolls. To understand why we create imaginary worlds, we must venture beyond the history books and into the inner workings of the human mind, examining the cognitive tools we use to construct our reality. At the heart of this phenomenon lies a powerful psychological engine known as cognitive dissonance. This is the profound mental discomfort we experience when we hold two conflicting ideas, or when we are confronted with information that doesn't fit into our existing understanding of the world. For our ancestors, the ultimate cognitive dissonance was the blank space on the map, a roaring silence where their knowledge simply ended. This void was psychologically intolerable. An unanswered question, an unresolved mystery, creates a kind of mental itch that demands to be scratched. The simplest and most satisfying way to resolve this dissonance is to fill the gap with an explanation, any explanation, even a speculative one. A sea serpent is paradoxically far less frightening than an empty ocean. The monster provides a narrative. It gives the unknown a name, a shape, and a set of predictable behaviors. It transforms a formless anxiety into a manageable problem. By drawing a dragon in the margin, the cartographer wasn't just decorating the page. He was engaging in a profound act of cognitive therapy, soothing the collective anxiety of a culture by providing a story that made the terrifying emptiness feel knowable and ordered. This process of fitting new information into pre-existing mental frameworks is explained by schema theory. A schema is a cognitive shortcut, a mental blueprint we use to organize and interpret the world. We have schemas for everything: what a restaurant is, how to behave at a funeral, what to expect from a map. When we encounter something new, our brain automatically tries to slot it into an existing schema. This is where the magic happens. When a medieval scholar read Pliny the Elder's description of the dog-headed cynosfolly, he didn't have a schema for an elaborate fiction presented as fact. His schema for ancient authority was one of reverence and trust, so his brain seamlessly incorporated these monstrous races into his schema for the inhabitants of distant lands. The map itself acted as a powerful spatial schema, a framework for organizing geographical knowledge. Once a feature, like the island of Antilia, was incorporated into that map schema, it became a cognitive fact. To remove it later was not a simple edit. It was a violent restructuring of an entire mental model of the world. Our brains are meaning-making machines, and they prefer a complete, even if flawed, schema to an incomplete and chaotic one. Imaginary worlds, from Atlantis to Wakanda, provide the missing pieces that make our cognitive schemas feel whole and coherent. We can see this cognitive machinery operating with beautiful clarity in the behavior of children. A child who builds a secret fort under the dining room table is not just playing. She is engaged in a critical act of cognitive development. She is creating a micro-world, a geography over which she has complete control. This space has rules, boundaries, and a purpose. It might be a castle under siege, a spaceship, or a hidden laboratory. In doing so, she is practicing the very same cognitive skills that her ancestors used to map the world. She is learning to impose order on chaos, to define a space and give it meaning. The imaginary friend is another perfect example. This invented companion allows the child to explore social dynamics, emotions, and relationships in a safe, consequence-free environment. It is a psychological sandbox. This is not a sign of delusion, but of a healthy, active mind learning to navigate reality by first constructing and navigating a fictional one. The child is a natural cartographer of the imagination. and the lessons learned in these imaginary realms form the foundation for understanding the complexities of the real world. As we mature, the expression of this impulse simply grows more sophisticated. The child's thought becomes the adult's meticulously curated fantasy football league, their elaborate model railway, or their deep immersion in a video game like World of Warcraft. These are not escapes from reality in a negative sense. They are parallel realities. They offer what psychologists call psychological attenuation, a reduction in the stresses and complexities of everyday life by allowing us to enter a world with clearer rules, more immediate feedback, and a greater sense of agency. In a video game, your actions have direct and visible consequences. Your quest to slay the dragon has a clear objective and a defined reward, something that is often frustratingly absent in the ambiguities of modern work and life. These imaginary worlds satisfy a deep hunger for purpose and mastery. They are the modern equivalent of the quest for Prester John or the Fountain of Youth, a structured journey with a goal that provides a profound sense of accomplishment and meaning. Ultimately, this drive to imagine and map the unreal is a fundamental part of our toolset for survival. Our ability to project ourselves into the future, to simulate outcomes, and to plan for scenarios that do not yet exist is one of humanity's greatest evolutionary advantages. This capacity for mental time travel and scenario building relies on the same cognitive muscles we use to create fantasy worlds. The early human who could imagine the path of a migrating herd or visualize the construction of a better tool was leveraging the power of the imagination for tangible gain. The line between a strategic plan and a fictional narrative is remarkably thin. Both involve creating a coherent sequence of events in a space that does not yet materially exist. In this light, the medieval mapmaker drawing paradise was not so different from a modern architect drawing blueprints for a building that is yet to be constructed. Both are using spatial representation to bring a non-existent reality into being. They are charting a potential future. Our need for imaginary worlds is therefore not a frivolous distraction. It is the wellspring of innovation, the foundation of storytelling, and the core cognitive process that allows us to learn, to plan, and to hope. It is the mechanism by which we continually reach beyond the limits of our current reality, using the map of the imagination to navigate toward a future we have first dared to dream. And so, the great age of exploration drew to a close, the final phantom islands scrubbed from the Admiralty charts by the hard, unyielding evidence of circumnavigation. The world had been mapped, its coastlines defined, its continents named. One might assume that the human impulse to chart the imaginary would fade away, rendered obsolete by satellite imagery and GPS coordinates. But the mind does not surrender its deepest needs so easily. The blank spaces had simply moved. They migrated from the parchment to the page, from the globe to the screen, and from the physical world to the boundless landscapes of modern storytelling. The art of mythical geography did not die. It evolved, finding vibrant new life in the 20th and 21st centuries, adapting to new media and speaking to new cultural anxieties and aspirations. Consider the profound shift represented by the work of H.P. Lovecraft. In the early 20th century, this reclusive writer from Providence, Rhode Island, turned the concept of mythical geography on its head. Whereas medieval cartographers placed wonders and monsters on the edges of a world centered on divine order, Lovecraft envisioned a universe that was utterly indifferent, if not outright hostile, to humanity. His Cthulhu mythos is a masterclass in creating a terrifying fictional geography that feels unnervingly real. At its heart lies the sunken city of Arlae, a non-Euclidean nightmare of slimy green stone, where geometry itself is blasphemous and the angles of the streets do not add up correctly. Lovecraft did not just name this place, he gave it a precise, albeit impossible, location in the South Pacific, at latitude 47 degrees 9 minutes south, longitude 126 degrees 43 minutes west. He populated his world with ancient, malevolent gods like Cthulhu, who lies dreaming in Arlaye, and other cosmic entities from locations like the distant star Zoth or the cold waste of Antarctica. This was not geography for the sake of adventure, but for the sake of dread. Lovecraft's maps charted the fragility of human sanity, using the language of coordinates and places to create a cosmology of cosmic horror, proving that mythical geographies could be just as effective at conveying terror as they once were at conveying wonder. At almost the same time, but from a completely different philosophical standpoint, another Oxford scholar was engaged in an even more monumental act of world-building. J.R.R. Tolkien did not merely write a story. He spent a lifetime constructing an entire secondary world, Middle-earth, with a depth and consistency that rivals the history of our own. A philologist by trade, Tolkien started with the languages. He created complete Elvish tongues with their own grammar and vocabulary, and the world grew out of them. The maps he drew for The Lord of the Rings are not decorative additions. They are essential to the narrative. The journey of the Fellowship from the Shire to Mordor is a real, tangible trek across a landscape that feels ancient and lived in. You can trace their path from the cozy hills of Hobbiton through the ancient forest of Fangorn across the plains of Rohan and to the very fires of Mount Doom. This meticulous geography gives the story its epic weight and scale. Readers don't just follow the plot, they feel the distance, the fatigue, and the topographical challenges the characters face. Tolkien's achievement was to make a mythical geography so coherent and richly detailed that it ceased to feel like a fiction, and instead felt like a lost history of our own world. His work set the standard for the modern high fantasy genre, demonstrating that the audience's desire for a fully realized, mappable world was stronger than ever. This desire for meaningful fictional places took a decisively political turn with the creation of Wakanda. First appearing in Marvel Comics in 1966, the African nation of Wakanda is a powerful example of a mythical geography designed as a direct commentary on identity and history. In a world scarred by the legacy of colonialism, Wakanda presented a stunning alternative reality. An African nation that was never conquered, never colonized, but instead developed in glorious isolation. Blessed with the miraculous metal vibranium, Wakanda became the most technologically advanced civilization on Earth, all while maintaining its ancient cultural traditions and sovereignty. The geography of Wakanda is crucial to its mythos. It is a hidden kingdom shielded from the outside world by a protective mountain range and a sophisticated holographic cloak. Its capital, Zana, is a breathtaking fusion of futuristic skyscrapers and traditional African architecture. Wakanda is not just a cool setting for superhero stories, it is a profound act of Afro-futurist imagination. It reclaims the narrative of Africa, rejecting the colonialist story of a dark continent and replacing it with a vision of power, innovation, and self-determination. It is a mythical geography born from a very real cultural need, a place on the map that allows for the exploration of complex questions about technology, responsibility, and global equity. The digital revolution provided the next great frontier for this ancient human impulse. With the rise of the internet, we witnessed the birth of virtual worlds, entire digital continents that exist only as code on servers, yet feel real to millions of people. Massively multiplayer online games like World of Warcraft or social platforms like the early Second Life are the direct descendants of the Hereford Mappa Mundi. They offer vast, meticulously mapped territories to explore, from the snowy peaks of Dun Morog to the sprawling cities of virtual social hubs. Players do not just observe these worlds, they inhabit them. They form communities, build virtual homes, undertake epic quests, and create their own stories within these predefined geographies. The map of Azeroth in World of Warcraft is as familiar to its players as the map of their own hometown. These digital realms satisfy the same deep-seated need for exploration and belonging that once drove sailors to seek out Hy-Brasil. They are the new Terra Incognita, the latest blank spaces that we, as a culture, are collectively filling with meaning, narrative, and social interaction. The medium has changed from parchment to pixel, but the fundamental human drive remains identical. We are still mapping our dreams, only now we do it with avatars and quest logs, building communities in landscapes that are every bit as real to us as the Phantom Islands were to the explorers of old. And so the great geographical mysteries of our planet were solved, the coastlines fixed, the last remote islands catalogued. The age of dragons on the map was over. But the human mind, it seems, cannot long abide a vacuum. No sooner had the final blank space on the terrestrial globe been filled in than we collectively set about creating a new one, an entire universe of uncharted territory that exists not in the physical world, but in the silent, invisible hum of servers and fiber optic cables. We call this new frontier cyberspace, a term coined by science fiction writer William Gibson that has since become part of our everyday language, and it is perhaps the most telling name we could have chosen. For space implies dimension, distance, and landscape. It suggests a geography that can and must be mapped. We have instinctively reached for the language of cartography to make sense of this digital unknown. We do not compute the internet, we navigate it. We talk about surfing the web as if riding the crest of a vast, information-rich wave. We speak of visiting websites as if they were destinations on a grand tour. We have home pages, we traverse domains, and we follow links that form pathways through an endless electronic library. These are not just casual metaphors, they are the cognitive tools we use to impose order on a realm that has no physical form. Just as a medieval traveler would need a mental map of the route from London to Rome, we need a conceptual map to find our way from a search engine to a social media platform to an online store. The interface of the internet itself is a map, a browser window is our ship, the address bar our compass, and the hyperlinks our sea lanes. We are all digital cartographers now, drawing mental charts of a territory that is constantly shifting and expanding. And like the cartographers of old, we are faced with a terra incognita of staggering proportions. This new world is almost infinitely vast with its surface web. The part indexed by search engines like Google representing only the familiar, well-lit coastlines. But beyond this lies the deep web, an expanse of unindexed content like private databases and academic journals, a kind of digital hinterland. And then there is the mythologized dark web, a place accessed only with special software, which functions in our modern imagination exactly like the perilous, monster-filled edges of a medieval map. It is spoken of in hushed tones, a lawless zone of anonymous actors and hidden dangers. Whether the reality matches the myth is almost beside the point. Its existence as a concept serves the same purpose as the dragons of old. It marks the boundary of the safe and the known, a warning of what lies in the digital abyss for those who venture too far without the right protections. Our attempts to literally map this space are as determined as those of any Renaissance explorer. Network engineers create intricate diagrams that look like constellations, tracing the physical and logical connections between servers across the globe. These are the modern equivalent of portolan charts, technical documents designed for the navigators of this new world. Companies like Google and Meta create another kind of map, a behavioral one. They track our clicks, our likes, our dwell time, and our purchases, constructing a detailed cartography of our desires, our friendships, and our beliefs. This data map is then used to predict our movements, to suggest new destinations and to show us advertisements tailored to our personal psychological landscape. It is a form of cartography so precise and invasive that it would have been unimaginable to the mapmakers of the past. And just as the old maps were filled with fantastical creatures, our discourse about the internet is populated with modern-day monsters and marvels. The mythical hacker, a shadowy figure capable of bringing down governments and emptying bank accounts with a few keystrokes, is the digital descendant of the sea serpent. The concept of the echo chamber or filter bubble is a new kind of mythical geography, an invisible, self-reinforcing territory where we only encounter opinions that mirror our own, a place that warps our perception of reality itself. Conversely, we have our digital utopias, the early dream of the internet as a global village, a pure democracy where information would set everyone free. These modern myths, whether of peril or promise, reveal our deepest anxieties and hopes about this new technology. They are the stories we tell ourselves to explain the unexplainable forces shaping our lives. The mapping of cyberspace is, therefore, not a break from tradition but the latest chapter in a very old story. It is the continuation of humanity's eternal project to impose geographical order on the unknown. The medium has changed from parchment to pixel, but the impulse is identical: to name the unnamed, to chart the uncharted, and to find our place within a vast and bewildering new world. The dragons have not disappeared, they have simply been reprogrammed. They are the viruses in our code, the trolls in our forums, and the algorithms that silently shape our thoughts. The age of mythical geography is far from over. We are living in its most ambitious and expansive era yet, building and mapping realms of pure information that are every bit as real and every bit as mysterious as the lost continents we once dreamed of finding across the sea. For centuries, the legends of sunken continents and lost worlds were questions that belonged to the realm of poets and philosophers, their truth measured by the power of the story rather than the weight of evidence. But with the dawn of the modern scientific age, these enduring myths faced a new kind of inquiry, one armed with tools capable of probing the deepest ocean trenches and the most ancient layers of rock. This shift was not an attempt to spoil the wonder, but to engage in a different kind of exploration, an investigation into the very bones of our planet to see if they could possibly support the weight of these magnificent stories. The results of this investigation would lead to one of the most profound corrections in human history, not just of our maps, but of our understanding of Earth's deep past. The most famous casualty of this scientific scrutiny is without a doubt the Legend of Atlantis. Plato's tale of a sophisticated civilization sinking beneath the waves in a single day and night presented a dramatic geological claim. For a long time, the idea of a continent simply vanishing into the Atlantic Ocean seemed plausible to those who had no concept of the immense forces shaping the Earth's crust. The breakthrough came with the development of the theory of plate tectonics in the 1960s. This revolutionary model revealed that the Earth's surface is not a static shell, but a dynamic puzzle of massive plates that move at a rate comparable to the growth of a fingernail. They drift apart at mid-ocean ridges, creating new seafloor, and collide at their edges, forcing one plate beneath another in a process called subduction, or crumpling upwards to form mountain ranges like the Himalayas. Plate tectonics provides a comprehensive explanation for the distribution of our continents without requiring a lost landmass in the middle of the Atlantic. The coastlines of Africa and South America fit together like pieces of a jigsaw because they were once joined, part of the ancient supercontinent of Pangaea. Over millions of years, the Atlantic Ocean basin slowly opened up as the plates diverged. There is no geological mechanism for a continent the size of Libya and Asia combined to have existed in the central Atlantic and then suddenly disappeared. The seafloor is not a sinkhole that can swallow a landmass whole. it is a record of incredibly slow, continuous creation and destruction. Sonar mapping and seafloor surveys have meticulously charted the entire Atlantic basin. What they reveal is a fascinating landscape of underwater mountains, vast abyssal plains, and the massive mid-Atlantic ridge, a volcanic mountain chain running north to south. But there is no trace of the concentric rings of water and land, the grand canals, or the sunken cities of Atlantis. The ocean floor tells a different, equally dramatic story, one of gradual, epic change over hundreds of millions of years, a timescale that utterly dwarfs the entire span of human civilization. The search for other mythical homelands met a similar fate in the hands of archaeologists. Expeditions have long sought the real-world locations of places like Hyperborea, the land of perfect climate beyond the north wind. Suggestions placed it in the Arctic or in northern regions like Scandinavia or Siberia. However, archaeological digs in these areas uncover evidence of ancient human habitation that is compelling in its own right. The remains of hardy hunter-gatherer societies who adapted to extreme conditions, not a race of giants living in a blissful, eternal spring. The evidence points to a struggle for survival, not a paradise. Similarly, countless attempts have been made to pinpoint the Garden of Eden, often by trying to locate the source of the 4 rivers mentioned in Genesis. Proposals have ranged from Mesopotamia to the Armenian highlands. While these regions are indeed the cradle of agriculture and some of the earliest known human settlements, like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, archaeologists find no evidence of a perfect, walled garden or a single point of origin for humanity. Instead, they find a complex patchwork story of human development across multiple continents, a narrative of gradual domestication of plants and animals and the slow rise of village life. The archaeological record reveals our true origins to be more distributed, more messy, and in many ways more fascinating than a single, pristine paradise. This scientific process of myth-busting is often misunderstood as a cold, dismissive exercise, a triumph of boring fact over beautiful fiction, but that perspective misses the point entirely. The goal of science is not to destroy wonder, but to refine it, to transfer our sense of awe from the imagined to the real. Learning that the seafloor was formed by the slow, relentless spreading of tectonic plates is a story of planetary power that is far more grand and humbling than the sudden cataclysm of Atlantis. Understanding that humanity emerged through a complex diaspora across the globe, adapting to countless environments, is a more empowering and inclusive origin story than being cast out from a single, exclusive garden. The scientific narrative replaces a simple, comforting myth with a complex, evidence-based reality that challenges us to think deeper. It is a necessary evolution in human thought, a maturation of our species from one that explained the world through stories to one that seeks to understand it through testable hypotheses and shared evidence. This journey began the moment the first explorer returned with a map that contradicted the ancient authorities, and it continues today as we use ever more sophisticated tools to read the true history written in the stones and the stars. But as we have seen, a map is never just a collection of lines and labels. It is a story, a declaration of values, and a projection of power. And with that power comes a profound and often overlooked responsibility. The history of cartography is not merely a chronicle of increasing accuracy. It is also a record of the ethical choices made by mapmakers, choices that have shaped perceptions, justified conquests, and defined the boundaries of humanity itself. The medieval cartographer who placed a tribe of headless Blemii in the heart of Africa was not making a neutral observation, he was making a statement. He was categorizing a people as monstrous, as fundamentally other, and in doing so he was drawing a line not just on parchment, but in the sand of human empathy. These depictions were not harmless curiosities. they served as potent propaganda, reinforcing a worldview that positioned European Christendom as the pinnacle of civilization, surrounded by increasingly savage and subhuman realms. When real-world explorers like the Portuguese and Spanish encountered the diverse cultures of West Africa and the Americas, they arrived with these maps already etched in their minds. The unfamiliar body paint, ritual practices, and social structures of indigenous peoples were often interpreted through the distorting lens of these pre-existing myths. A complex society could be dismissed as a land of savages, making the atrocities of colonialism and the slave trade psychologically easier to justify. The map in these instances was not a tool for understanding, but a weapon for dehumanization, proving that the pen, or in this case the quill, can be mightier than the sword when it comes to carving up the world. Today, the power of the cartographer has grown exponentially, even if the tools have changed from parchment to pixels. We live in an age of unprecedented data collection and digital mapping. A company like Google has undertaken the monumental task of mapping not just every street on Earth, but also layering that map with immense amounts of information, real-time traffic, business reviews, photographs, and the digital footprints of billions of users. This is a service of incredible utility, but it also represents a concentration of cartographic power that would have been unimaginable to the creators of the Hereford Mappa Mundi. The algorithms that determine what appears at the top of your search results when you look for a restaurant or a tourist attraction are, in effect, creating a personalized map of relevance for each user. This process, while convenient, raises a critical ethical question for the modern cartographer. Are these algorithms simply reflecting reality, or are they actively constructing it? When your map consistently shows you a certain type of business or a particular political viewpoint, it can create a digital filter bubble, a kind of personalized mythical geography that reinforces your existing beliefs and shields you from conflicting information. Your world, as defined by your digital map, begins to shrink to the dimensions of your own preferences, creating a modern-day equivalent of the medieval map that placed Jerusalem at the center of everything. The map is no longer a one-size-fits-all document. It is a custom-tailored reality, and the tailors are the programmers who design the algorithms. This power extends far beyond finding the best coffee shop. The practice of data mapping and gerrymandering has become a central tool in modern political campaigns. By aggregating vast amounts of demographic and voting data, political strategists can draw hyper-precise electoral district boundaries. The goal is not to create a geographically coherent or representative district, but to carefully carve up the electorate to concentrate opposition voters into a few districts while spreading your own supporters across many, ensuring political dominance. This is a form of cartographic manipulation as deliberate and impactful as any mythical sea serpent. It creates a political geography that is utterly disconnected from the organic communities on the ground, a fictional landscape designed to produce a predetermined outcome at the ballot box. The map, in this context, ceases to be a representation of the people and becomes a tool for silencing their voices. It raises the unsettling possibility that the most influential mythical geographies of our time are not lost continents, but the invisible, algorithmically drawn boundaries that shape our democracies. So what, then, is the ethical responsibility of today's cartographer? It must begin with a commitment to transparency and a humble acknowledgement of bias. Just as a medieval mapmaker should have been transparent about using Pliny the Elder as a source, a modern mapping company should be clear about how its algorithms prioritize information. What values are baked into the code? Is the goal to maximize engagement, which often favors sensational or divisive content, or is it to present a balanced and accurate view of the world? The ethical cartographer must strive for accuracy, but also be upfront about the limitations and perspectives inherent in any act of representation. A map is always a reduction, a simplification of a gloriously complex reality. The responsible mapmaker acknowledges this simplification and invites the user to look beyond it. Furthermore, there is a growing movement towards participatory mapping, where local communities are empowered to contribute their own knowledge to digital platforms. This decentralizes the power of the cartographer and allows for a more nuanced, grassroots understanding of a place to emerge, challenging the top-down, often corporate or state-controlled narrative. Ultimately, the history of mythical geography offers us a vital lesson in media literacy. It teaches us that every map tells a story, and every storyteller has a point of view. As consumers of maps, we have a responsibility to become critical cartographers ourselves. We must learn to read between the lines, to ask probing questions of the maps we use every day. Who created this map, and for what purpose? What information is included, and just as importantly, what is left out? What story is this map trying to tell me, and what alternative stories might it be obscuring? Whether we are looking at a centuries-old parchment adorned with dragons or a glowing smartphone screen guiding us through a city, we must remember that we are not looking at an objective window onto the world. We are reading a carefully crafted narrative. The journey to becoming an ethical consumer of maps begins the moment we understand that the most dangerous monsters are not the ones drawn in the margins, but the unseen biases and unstated agendas that can shape our perception of reality itself. Yet, even as the last phantom islands faded from nautical charts and the final coastlines of the globe were inked in, the human hunger for a final, great geographical mystery refused to be extinguished. By the dawn of the 20th century, the world map appeared complete. The poles were being conquered, the continents crossed by rail and telegraph. It seemed the age of terrestrial mystery was over. But there remained one last great blank space, not of ocean, but of verdant, impenetrable green, the Amazon rainforest, and into this vast, uncharted interior, the old pattern of mythical geography would repeat itself with a tragic and haunting intensity in the story of one man, Lieutenant Colonel Percy Fawcett. Fawcett was no armchair dreamer. He was a seasoned British explorer, a hardened artillery officer, and a skilled surveyor for the Royal Geographical Society. He had spent years mapping contested borders in the jungles of South America, earning a reputation for incredible endurance and an almost supernatural ability to survive where others perished. He was, by all accounts, a man of science and observation, but during his travels he became captivated by fragments of evidence and local legends that pointed to something monumental hidden deep within the Amazon basin. He studied ancient manuscripts in Rio de Janeiro, including a disputed 18th-century document known as Manuscript 512, which described a lost, silver-rich city with multi-storied buildings, wide roads and arches, discovered by Bandeirante explorers generations earlier. More compellingly, he listened to the stories of indigenous peoples who spoke of grand ancestors and stone cities reclaimed by the jungle. Fawcett, synthesizing these clues with his own observations of sophisticated earthworks and pottery shards, became convinced that the Amazon had not always been a pristine wilderness. He believed it had once been home to a large, advanced civilization, which he cryptically named simply Z. His theory flew in the face of the anthropological consensus of his time, which viewed the Amazon as incapable of supporting anything beyond small, nomadic tribes. But Fawcett envisioned something far grander than a simple settlement. He was not searching for a city of gold like the cliched El Dorado. He was searching for a cradle of civilization, a place that would rewrite the history of the Americas. His Z was to be a philosophical and archaeological discovery, proof of a complex, ancient society that had mastered its environment before vanishing. This distinction is crucial. Fawcett's quest was driven by a mix of genuine scientific intuition. Modern archaeology has since revealed the Amazon was indeed home to complex, large-scale societies and a profound, almost mystical romanticism. He saw himself as a lone visionary, destined to unveil a truth that the complacent academic establishment was too blind to see. His final expedition, launched in 1925, captured the world's imagination. Accompanied by his eldest son, Jack, and Jack's lifelong friend, Rolly Rimmel, Fawcett ventured into the uncharted region of the Brazilian Mato Grosso. He deliberately traveled light, shunning large, well-armed parties that he believed would attract hostility and delay. He believed his reputation for fairness with indigenous tribes and his sheer force of will would see them through. The last communication from the party was a letter Fawcett sent back from a spot he called Dead Horse Camp, in which he expressed optimism about their prospects. Then silence. They vanished without a trace into the immense, green unknown. The disappearance of Percy Fawcett ignited one of the greatest exploration mysteries of the 20th century. It was a drama that played out in the new age of global media, with headlines around the world speculating on his fate. Over the next decades, more than 100 expeditions, lured by the romance of the story, the hope of fame, or the lure of a lost city, ventured into the Amazon to find him. Many of these rescuers themselves succumbed to disease, starvation, or hostile encounters, adding their own names to the grim ledger of the quest for Z. Each new theory emerged. Perhaps Fawcett had gone native and lived out his days as a chief of an uncontacted tribe. Perhaps he and his party had been killed. Perhaps he had simply stumbled upon the truth he was seeking and chosen to remain in his lost world. The mystery was a perfect storm, blending the romance of exploration with the terror of the unknown, and it ensured that Fawcett's phantom city would loom larger in death than it ever had in life. The story of Percy Fawcett is the ultimate testament to the enduring power of mythical geography long after the map was declared finished. The Amazon jungle, with its tangled canopy and endless rivers, became the 20th century's equivalent of the Sea of Darkness, a blank space that defied modern technology and invited mythical insertion. Fawcett's quest proves that the template established by the seekers of Prester John and El Dorado remained potent. It was still driven by that powerful alchemy of a few tantalizing clues, a deep-seated desire for transcendent discovery, and an obsessive personality willing to risk everything. The jungle, like the ocean before it, did not give up its secrets easily. It consumed those who sought to impose their dreams upon it, reminding us that the greatest challenge of exploration is not just mapping the landscape, but navigating the treacherous and alluring geography of our own hopes. But if the dense jungles of the Amazon represented the last great terrestrial mystery, there was another frontier that captivated a different kind of imagination, one that turned the very concept of exploration on its head. For centuries, the unknown had been a matter of latitude and longitude, a quest to sail across the seas or trek across the land. Yet a small but determined group of thinkers became convinced that the greatest mystery of all was not spread across the surface of the globe, but lay hidden deep within it. They looked not to the horizon, but downward, proposing a mythical geography so radical it defied common sense. The theory that our planet is not a solid ball of rock, but a hollow shell containing within it an entire world, complete with inner continents, oceans, and even its own central sun. This was the hollow earth theory, and it represents a fascinating pivot in the history of mythical geography, proving that when the map of the surface was complete, the human imagination would simply dig deeper. The roots of this idea are surprisingly ancient, tapping into a universal human fascination with the underworld. Nearly every culture has myths of subterranean realms, from the gloomy Greek Hades to the Norse Svartalfheim, the home of the dark elves. These were often places of the dead, shadowy reflections of the world above. But the hollow earth theory took this mythological concept and gave it a scientific veneer. One of the first prominent figures to do so was the brilliant English astronomer Edmund Halley of Halley's Comet fame. In the 1690s, Halley was grappling with anomalous readings in the Earth's magnetic field. To explain these variations, he proposed a startling hypothesis. Perhaps the Earth was a series of concentric shells, each with its own magnetic poles, all rotating at slightly different speeds. He even suggested that the luminous atmosphere between these shells might escape through thin sections at the poles, causing the aurora borealis. For Halley, this was a serious, if flawed, scientific model, but it planted a powerful seed. The idea that the planet's interior was not just molten rock, but a structured, habitable space, had entered the realm of scientific speculation. This seed blossomed into a full-blown cultural phenomenon in the 19th century, fueled by a combination of romanticism and a growing public appetite for exploration. The man who became the theory's most fervent evangelist was an American Army officer named John Cleves Sims, Jr. In 1818, Sims began a relentless campaign, publishing circulars and petitioning the U.S. Congress with a bold proclamation. He asserted that the Earth was hollow and habitable within, and that it was open at both poles. These enormous holes, he argued, led to a warm, verdant interior world. Sims wasn't just a theorist, he was a man of action. He tirelessly lobbied for a government-funded expedition to the North Pole to sail right through the polar opening and into the interior world. He even proposed naming the new continents after his financial backers. Although he died before seeing his dream realized, his Sims Holes theory captivated the public imagination. His son even had a stone monument erected in his memory, topped with a hollow stone globe, a lasting tribute to the man who tried to turn the world inside out. The allure of this inner world was too potent to remain confined to scientific pamphlets and congressional petitions. It found its ultimate expression in one of the most beloved adventure novels ever written, Jules Verne's Journey to the Center of the Earth, published in 1864. Verne took the scientific speculation of his day and transformed it into a breathtaking narrative. His heroes, Professor Lidenbrock and his nephew Axel, descend through an Icelandic volcano into a vast subterranean world, complete with a central sea, towering mushrooms, a lost sky of atmospheric gases that creates weather, and prehistoric creatures roaming the shores. Verne's genius was to make the impossible feel tangible. He used the latest geological theories of his time to ground his fantasy, creating a sense of scientific plausibility that made the journey feel like a thrillingly possible future of exploration. The book was a monumental success, cementing the hollow Earth as a permanent fixture in the popular imagination and inspiring generations of readers to wonder what marvels might lie just beneath their feet. The theory's appeal was multifaceted. For some, it was a perfect vehicle for utopian fantasies. If the surface world was corrupted by war, greed, and social inequality, perhaps the interior world was a pristine paradise, a hidden sanctuary where a more perfect society could flourish untouched by the ills of mankind. This idea was explored in novels and esoteric texts, which described the inner world as the home of a superior race, sometimes called the Agarthans, who possessed advanced wisdom and technology. For others, the polar openings offered a convenient explanation for otherwise puzzling natural phenomena. Why were mammoth carcasses sometimes found frozen in the Siberian tundra with fresh buttercups in their stomachs? Hollow Earth proponents argued that these animals had wandered out from the warm, lush interior through the polar openings and had been quickly frozen. The theory became a catch-all solution for any scientific anomaly that challenged conventional understanding. Of course, the entire edifice of the Hollow Earth theory was built on a foundation that modern geology has completely dismantled. We now know through the study of seismic waves that the Earth has a layered structure, a thin, solid crust, a thick, mostly solid mantle, a liquid outer core, and a solid inner core. The way these waves travel and refract through the planet leaves no room for vast interior caverns or a central sun. The immense pressure and temperature increase dramatically with depth, making any habitable space impossible. The theory of plate tectonics further explains the dynamics of the Earth's surface without needing a hollow interior. The poles themselves have been thoroughly mapped by satellites and explored by icebreakers and submarines. There are no gaping holes leading to another world, only the shifting ice of the Arctic and the frozen continent of Antarctica. Yet, the utter debunking of the hollow Earth theory does not diminish its significance. In fact, its persistence highlights a crucial point about mythical geography. It demonstrates that the unknown is not a fixed quantity, it is a moving target. As one frontier closes, another is imagined. When the oceans were crossed and the continents mapped, the next logical frontier was downward, into the planet itself, and later upward into space. The hollow Earth theory was a bridge between terrestrial and extraterrestrial exploration, a vertical counterpart to the horizontal journeys of the Age of Sail. It showed that the human desire to discover a new world was so powerful that if one couldn't be found across the sea, it would be invented beneath the ground. It was the ultimate act of cartographic ingenuity, not filling a blank space on a map, but proposing an entirely new kind of map, one that charted the world within, a final, magnificent testament to the idea that the greatest journeys are not always to distant shores, but sometimes into the deepest recesses of what we believe is possible. And so we have seen how mythical maps guided explorers across real oceans, and how the human mind instinctively populates the unknown with monsters and marvels. But there is another, even more profound purpose for these non-existent geographies, one that turns the map into a moral compass. Throughout history, when thinkers have wanted to critique the flaws of their own society or imagine a radically better one, they have consistently reached for the same powerful tool, the fictional map. They have designed perfect societies on imaginary islands, creating detailed blueprints for a better world set safely apart from the messy complications of the present. This is the world of utopian literature, and it represents the most deliberate and influential application of mythical geography ever conceived. The template for this entire tradition was set more than 2,000 years ago, not by a novelist but by a philosopher. Plato's story of Atlantis, which we first encountered as a geographical phantom, serves a double purpose. While it captivated mapmakers with its description of a sunken island, its primary function in Plato's dialogues was not to describe a real place, but to illustrate a philosophical argument. Atlantis is presented as the antithesis of his ideal state, a powerful and technologically advanced civilization that becomes greedy, arrogant, and militarily aggressive. Its eventual destruction by the gods is a moral lesson about the consequences of hubris and the loss of virtue. Crucially, Plato gives Atlantis a specific geography, its concentric rings of water and land, its location beyond the Pillars of Hercules, to make its downfall feel tangible and real. He wasn't just telling a parable, he was mapping a cautionary tale. By grounding his social critique in a detailed, albeit fictional, geography, Plato made the abstract concepts of justice and corruption feel immediate and consequential. He demonstrated that placing an idea on a map gives it a weight and an authority that a simple statement could never achieve. This brilliant technique lay dormant for centuries until it was revived with explosive force during the Renaissance. In 1516, the English lawyer and statesman Thomas More published a book that would give this entire genre its name, Utopia. The title itself is a masterful pun, crafted from the Greek words eutopos, meaning good place, and utopos, meaning no place. With this single, clever name, More perfectly captures the essence of the project. His Utopia is an island republic located somewhere in the New World, recently discovered by a fictional traveler. Moore describes this society with meticulous detail. Its cities are identically planned. Its citizens work only 6 hours a day. There is no private property, and religious tolerance is the law of the land. But this was far more than a whimsical fantasy. Utopia is a piercing satire of the profound social problems plaguing 16th-century England: rampant poverty, corrupt landowners, pointless wars, and religious persecution. By describing a society that had solved these problems, Moore was holding up a mirror to his own world, showing them not just what was wrong, but how it could be fixed. The island setting was essential. It isolated the experiment, allowing Moore to design a society from the ground up without having to explain how it evolved from the flawed European model. The map of Utopia was a clean slate, a laboratory for social thought. This tradition of using an imaginary geography as a political laboratory continued to evolve. A century after Moore, the philosopher and scientist Francis Bacon wrote New Atlantis, an unfinished work published in 1627. Bacon's vision shifted the focus from social organization to scientific progress. His mythical island of Bensalem, discovered in the remote Pacific, is a society governed by a scientific research institute called Salomon's House. The purpose of this society is the knowledge of causes and secret motions of things, and the enlarging of the bounds of human empire to the effecting of all things possible. In New Atlantis, scientists are the ruling class, and their discoveries are used to improve health, agriculture, and quality of life for all. Bacon was using his fictional map to advocate for the real-world institutionalization of science, a vision that would later inspire the creation of the Royal Society in London. Like Moore, he placed his ideal on a distant island, making it a plausible discovery rather than a theoretical construct. The map provided a stage upon which a new relationship between knowledge and power could be performed. What makes these utopian maps so powerful is that they are not vague dreams. They are incredibly specific blueprints. Moore doesn't just say utopians are tolerant. He describes the exact laws that guarantee freedom of worship. Bacon doesn't just wish for scientific advancement. He outlines the hierarchical structure of Salomon's House, complete with different ranks of scientists with specific duties. This specificity transforms them from mere stories into serious political proposals. They move beyond criticizing what is and begin to articulate with practical detail what could be. The fictional island becomes a constitutional convention, a think tank, and a policy paper all rolled into one. This practice of social cartography, of literally mapping out a better society, did not end with the age of exploration. It found a new expression in the 19th and 20th centuries with the rise of intentional communities. Groups like the Shakers in America or the utopian socialists like Robert Owen, who founded New Harmony in Indiana, were attempting to build their own utopias and new Atlantises on real soil. They took the blueprints from the page and tried to translate them into living, breathing communities, using a shared map of an ideal society to guide their collective life. Today, the impulse continues, but the geography has shifted once again from distant islands to the ultimate frontier, space. The designs for future space colonies or settlements on Mars are the direct descendants of Thomas More's Utopia. Scientists and visionaries are creating incredibly detailed plans for enclosed, self-sustaining habitats that must carefully manage every aspect of life, from atmosphere and food production to social structure and governance. These are not just engineering challenges, they are profound exercises in social design. How will resources be distributed? What system of law will prevail? How will cultural life be maintained in such an isolated environment? These are the same questions that Moore and Bacon grappled with. The schematics for a rotating space station are the new maps of Utopia. representing the enduring human hope that on a new world with a clean slate, we might finally get it right. The mapping of Utopia, therefore, is far more than an intellectual game. It is one of the most powerful tools we have for social change. By first charting a better world in the imagination, we create a destination to strive for. These maps of non-existent places become catalysts, inspiring generations to bridge the gap between the world as it is and the world as it could be, proving that the most important journeys often begin not with a step but with a drawing. And so, our journey across the parchment of imagination draws to a close. We have sailed from the dragon-guarded edges of the medieval Mundi through the sunken spires of Atlantis to the digital constellations of cyberspace. This voyage reveals a truth far more fascinating than any single myth. The act of mapping the unreal is not a historical aberration or a sign of primitive thinking. It is a profound and universal human activity, as intrinsic to our nature as language or storytelling. For millennia, we have used the precise language of geography, the careful placement of mountains, the tracing of rivers, the naming of islands, to document the landscapes of our collective psyche. These non-existent realms were never simple mistakes to be corrected by better instruments. They were essential components of our worldviews, vital tools for navigating the terrifying and wonderful complexities of existence. They were driven by a powerful quartet of human emotions, a burning curiosity about what lay beyond the next horizon, a deep-seated fear of the formless unknown, an abiding faith in stories that gave the world meaning, and an unquenchable hope for something more, something better just out of sight. These cartographic dreams were engines of history. They were the siren songs that launched real wooden ships into the terrifying void of the Sea of Darkness, sending explorers like Columbus and Cook across oceans in pursuit of phantoms like Antilia and Terra Australis. They were the muses that inspired some of our greatest art, from Thomas More's satirical island of Utopia to J.R.R. Tolkien's meticulously charted Middle-earth, proving that the human need for a mapped narrative is as strong in literature as it was in navigation. Most fundamentally, these mythical geographies served as mirrors, allowing cultures to define themselves by depicting what they were not. The monstrous races placed at the edges of the world reinforced a sense of central, civilized identity, while the quest for a Christian king like Prester John revealed deep-seated political and religious aspirations. The map was never just a tool, it was a statement of values, a declaration of faith, and a portrait of a culture's deepest fears and highest hopes. Yet, as we stand today with the entire physical globe charted, down to the last atoll and river delta, it would be a mistake to think this ancient impulse has faded. Science may have filled in the physical blanks, but the human drive to chart the unknown has simply migrated to new frontiers. We are now mapping realms that are, in their own way, just as vast and mysterious as the Atlantic Ocean once was. Our telescopes are charting the cosmic geography of exoplanets and distant galaxies, searching for habitable worlds in the ultimate terra incognita of space. Our submersibles are diving into the Hadal Zone, mapping alien ecosystems at the ocean's deepest trenches, the modern equivalent of probing the abyss for sea serpents. Neuroscientists are creating connectomes, intricate maps of the human brain's neural pathways, attempting to navigate the most complex structure in the known universe, the seat of consciousness itself. And as we have seen, we are all now digital cartographers, using the metaphors of geography to navigate the boundless, non-physical realm of the internet, a space populated by its own modern myths of hackers, echo chambers, and digital utopias. The maps of these ancient realms that never were offer us a crucial and enduring lesson. They remind us that reality is not merely a collection of measurable, physical facts. It is also, and perhaps more importantly, shaped by what we believe, what we fear, and what we dare to imagine. A map is not a neutral window onto the world. It is a story we tell ourselves about our place within it. The dragons on the parchment were as real as any coastline to the people who believed in them because they shaped decisions, inspired journeys, and defined a worldview. This legacy challenges us to be conscious cartographers of our own minds, to recognize the maps we use to navigate our lives, the assumptions, the biases, the hopes, and to understand that they, too, shape the reality we experience. The greatest and most mysterious geography we will ever explore does not lie across any ocean or on any distant planet. It is the limitless, ever-changing landscape of the human imagination, the source of every phantom island, every dreamed of paradise, and every bold leap into the unknown. Our journey across the maps of ancient realms concludes not with an ending, but with an invitation to never stop charting the magnificent, uncharted territories of our own potential. And so our own expedition across these incredible maps of the mind reaches its final destination. But as any great explorer knows, the end of one journey is simply the starting point for the next. You now hold a new lens through which to view the world, or more accurately, to view the maps that claim to represent it. The next time you have the chance to stand before an ancient map in a museum or browse a digital archive online, I urge you to lean in a little closer. Don't just look for the familiar coastlines of Europe or the trade routes of the Silk Road. Let your gaze drift to the edges, to the blank spaces and the decorative flourishes. Seek out the dragons, the sea serpents, the proud notation of here be lions in the heart of Africa. Find the phantom islands like Hy-Brasil or the island of the Seven Cities, drawn with such confidence by cartographers who truly believed they were out there. See these features not as errors, but as profound cultural statements, as chapters in the great story of how we have tried to understand our place in the cosmos. This perspective isn't just about the past either. It invites a fascinating question for our own time. What are the mythical geographies we are creating today? What are the modern equivalents of Prester John's kingdom or the earthly paradise? Perhaps they are the digital frontiers we discussed, the filter bubbles and echo chambers that algorithmically construct a personalized reality for each of us. Maybe they are the visions of a pristine, untouched wilderness that often overlooks the long history of human interaction with the land. Or perhaps they are the futuristic cityscapes and off-world colonies we imagine as utopian solutions to our present-day challenges. By recognizing this enduring human impulse, we become more critical readers of the maps, both literal and figurative, that guide our lives today. If this journey has sparked your curiosity to dive even deeper, there are some wonderful resources waiting for you. I highly recommend picking up a book like The Phantom Atlas by Edward Brooke Hitching, which is a beautifully illustrated celebration of these very cartographic ghosts. For a more scholarly but utterly captivating read, the History of Cartography series from the University of Chicago Press is an unparalleled resource. And the best part is, you don't even need to leave your home to explore these wonders. Institutions like the Library of Congress and the British Library have digitized vast collections of their historical maps, allowing you to zoom in on the very sea monsters and mythical kingdoms we've discussed, all from your screen. It's the closest thing we have to a time machine. Now, I am incredibly curious to hear from you. This conversation about the power of imagination is one that thrives on shared perspectives. So please leave a comment below and tell me, which of these mythical realms from history or fiction captivates you the most? Is it the timeless mystery of Atlantis, the technological marvel of Wakanda, the spiritual quest for Shambhala, or perhaps a personal favorite from a novel or game? Let's build a collective atlas of imagination right here. And if you've enjoyed this voyage into the intersection of maps, myth, and history, then you are exactly the kind of curious mind I make these videos for. Consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss our next adventure. We have so many more historical mysteries to unravel together, from forgotten empires to enigmatic artifacts. Be sure to tap that notification bell as well. That way, you'll be the first to know when we embark on the next journey into the maps of our collective dreams. Thank you for your time, for your curiosity, and for sharing this exploration. Until next time, keep looking at the